Welcome, welcome. You're here at The Fiction Wizard. Today we present to you, what if Fleur's grandmother found Harry age 7 and her Veela fire shattered 45 binding charms placed since infancy. Like and subscribe if you want more awesome stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Chapter 1, The fire that seized the summer of 1987 smelled like cut grass and exhaust fumes and the particular kind of quiet that settles over English suburbs on a Wednesday afternoon when nothing is supposed to happen. Céleste Beaumont had been walking for 11 minutes. She knew this because she counted steps when she was in unfamiliar places, an old habit, older than most of the buildings on this street, older than the concept of Surrey itself as far as she was concerned. She was dressed in what her granddaughter Fleur called tenue de muggle, a cream linen blazer, dark trousers, low heels that clicked against the pavement with the steady authority of someone who had never once questioned her right to be wherever she happened to be. Her hair was silver white and worn up, and her face, for a woman of her considerable age, was composed entirely of elegant angles and an expression that suggested she found the world perpetually interesting and occasionally disappointing. She was on her way back to the Ministry liaison's car. The diplomatic errand had taken less time than expected. These things usually did when you walked into a room and were, unmistakably and without effort, a full-blooded Veela. Wizards tended to reach agreements quite quickly in those circumstances. It was one of the minor conveniences of being what she was. She turned onto Privet Drive and stopped walking. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a smell. It was something that happened in the oldest part of her, the part that existed before language, before civilization, before the careful scaffolding of society that witches and wizards and even Veela had built over their more instinctual natures. It was the part that knew fire, and knew wrong, and knew the difference between the two. Something was here. Something was caged. Céleste stood very still on the pavement and let her senses spread outward the way she had been doing since before the grandmothers of the women she now called old had been born. The street resolved itself into layers. The Muggle houses with their mundane anxieties, mortgage payments, a husband who drank too much, a teenage girl practicing piano badly. The thin, regulated traces of ministry-approved household charms. A cat, one garden over, watching her with the particular intensity that meant it was almost certainly not a cat. And then, there. Number 4. The magic coming from that house was wrong in the way that a broken bone is wrong. It was dense and layered and deliberately suppressed, coiled in on itself like something that had been systematically taught that it had no right to exist. She had encountered suppressed magic before, in children raised by frightened parents, in witches and wizards who had suffered trauma. This was not that. This was engineered. Layer upon layer upon layer of intentional binding, each one sitting atop the last with the careful precision of someone who had been doing it repeatedly, methodically, over years. She counted, because counting was what she did, and what she counted made her go very still in a different way than before. 45. 45 binding charms on a child. The top layers were less than a year old. The deepest ones went all the way back to infancy. Céleste Beaumont had lived for a very long time. She had walked through 2 wizarding wars and 1 Muggle one and an incident in 1903 that no one had properly named but which she still thought about on certain evenings. She had felt rage of various temperatures and varieties and she had long since developed the self-possession to do something useful with it rather than simply letting it burn things. She walked up the front path of number 4 Privet Drive and knocked on the door. The woman who answered had a neck like a giraffe and eyes that performed the interesting trick of being simultaneously suspicious and empty. She looked at Céleste the way people sometimes looked at things they found beautiful and immediately distrusted. "Yes," said Petunia Dursley. "I would like," said Céleste, in English that was accented but absolutely precise, "to come inside." It was not phrased as a request. Petunia Dursley stepped aside. Céleste did not look around the hallway with any particular curiosity. She already knew what she needed to know about this house from the quality of its silence, the specific tidiness that comes not from contentment but from the rigid enforcement of normalcy as ideology. The photographs on the wall told the rest of the story. A fat, pink, pleased-looking boy at every stage of development. And nowhere, in any frame, a second child. "Where is the boy?" she said. Petunia's chin came up. "Dudley is at a friend's, the other boy." The silence that followed was extremely informative. "I don't know what the cupboard under the stairs," said Celeste, not looking at Petunia, "is not a bedroom." She walked to it. Petunia made a sound and then, apparently, thought better of whatever she had been about to do, because she didn't follow. Celeste crouched slightly, the ceiling in this hallway was lower than she preferred, and opened the cupboard door. The child inside was asleep. He was small. Too small for 7, which she knew he was because she had done the arithmetic on the magical signature the moment she'd felt it. The charms were dated, the oldest ones tied to a specific magical event in 1981 that the entire wizarding world knew about. He was curled on a cot that was barely wide enough for him, in a space that smelled of dust and old trainers and the particular staleness of somewhere that didn't get enough air. His hair was the specific kind of black that looked almost blue in certain lights. He had a scar on his forehead in the shape of a lightning bolt, which she had expected. What she had not expected was how the magic felt up close. From the street it had been wrong. Up close it was agonizing, and she was not even the one bearing it. The binding sat on him like, she searched for the right word and found it immediately, because she had, in her very long life, seen this done to one other person, like a cage built inside the skin. Each charm was connected to the others in a web that would have taken considerable skill and considerable time and, she noted with a cold and furious clarity, considerable ongoing maintenance. These had not been placed once and left. They had been tended. Someone had been here, or sent someone here, regularly, to make sure they held. Harry Potter slept through all of this. She wondered how long he had been sleeping, not tonight, but in general. How long had this child been moving through the world with 45 chains on his soul and no one to tell him it wasn't normal to feel this way? She put one hand very lightly on the doorframe. Not touching him yet. Thinking. Celeste was not impulsive. She had not survived this long by being impulsive. There were protocols, ministry protocols, international wizarding law protocols, the protocols of non-interference that the French and British ministries had been arguing about for 40 years. There was the question of the wards on this property, which she could feel too, Dumbledore's work, strong and old and tied to the blood protection of the woman in the hallway behind her. There was also a 7-year-old child in a cupboard. She thought for perhaps 4 seconds. Then she placed her hand on his forehead, very gently, and she let her fire come. Veela fire is not the fire of dragons or phoenixes or the common incendio. It is not destructive in the ordinary sense. It is true. It is the magic of pure intent made thermal. It burns what it burns because those things are, on some fundamental level, false. It burns lies. It burns coercion. It burns the specific magical structures that exist to diminish, control, or erase. 45 binding charms had no idea what was about to happen to them. The first one went quietly. A small, precise unraveling, like a knot pulled loose by someone who knew exactly which thread to find. Then the second, and the third, and Celeste felt the shape of each one as it came undone. She was reading them as they burned, because information was important and she intended to know exactly who had done this. The ministry's signature was on 11 of them. Standard suppression work, the kind used on children deemed too powerful for their own good, which in her experience meant too powerful for someone else's comfort. Dumbledore's signature was on 16. She catalogued this without feeling anything about it yet. She would feel things about it later, at length, and in person. The remaining 18 were something else. Darker. Older. Not ministry standard work. These had been placed by someone who understood that they were not just limiting power but actively reshaping magical identity, redirecting what Harry's magic would reach toward, altering the channels of his instinct, making certain connections impossible that should have been entirely natural. She had seen this kind of work before too. It was the magical equivalent of putting blinders on a horse, except you were also feeding the horse a diet specifically designed to make it small and slow and dependent. She filed the signatures. She would deal with them. The fire built as she worked. By the 14th charm it was visible, a soft, warm light, golden white, that a muggle looking in might have described as sunlight pouring from a very localized source. By the 28th it was generating enough heat that the dust motes in the cupboard were moving in the thermal currents and the spider in the upper corner had relocated itself to somewhere with more reasonable temperatures. By the 40th Harry woke up. His eyes opened. They were very green. The specific green of something growing in good soil, which struck her as either poetic or simply accurate. Both options seemed reasonable. He looked at her hand on his forehead. He looked at the light. He looked at her face. "You're on fire," he said. His voice was entirely calm. "Yes," said Celeste. Is that magic?" "Yes." He considered this with the gravity of a small person who had evidently learned early not to ask too many questions too fast. Then he said, "It doesn't hurt." "It should not hurt," she said. "This kind of fire is not for hurting children." 3 more charms dissolved. He felt them go, she could tell because his breath changed, a sharp intake, like someone removing bandages from a wound that had been there so long the person had stopped noticing the weight of them. His magic, freed incrementally with each binding that burned away, was beginning to move differently. Reaching. Reorienting. Like a hand that had been held in a fist for so long it was now, slowly, learning to open. "There are a lot of them," she said, conversationally. She was on 39. "Do you feel that? Each time one goes?" "Yeah," he said. He was sitting up now, watching her with an attention that she found immediately remarkable. Most children his age, in this situation, would be frightened or crying or calling for the adult in the next room. This child was watching. Cataloging. "It feels like breathing more. Like the air gets bigger." "That is a good way to describe it," she said, and meant it. 42. 43. The magic coming off him now was extraordinary. She had expected power. The legend of Harry Potter was well known even in France. The boy who lived, the chosen one, the child who had somehow survived the killing curse, but legends had a way of being about the event rather than the person. What she was feeling now was not legendary. It was personal. His magic had a texture, a quality, that was entirely its own. It moved like water finding its level, unassuming and inevitable, and it was warm in a way that magical signatures usually weren't. She had felt warm magic before only in 2 categories: very old, very settled wizards who had made peace with themselves over decades, and Veela. A 7-year-old orphan in a cupboard in Surrey should not have felt like either of those things. And yet. 44. She paused on the last one because it was different. The 45th charm was the oldest. Placed, she estimated, within days of his arrival here, possibly the same night. And it was not ministry work, not Dumbledore's work, not the unknown third party's work. It was something else entirely. Older than all of them. Placed with an intention she had to sit with for a moment before she could name it. It was a suppressor, yes. But it was also a guide. It had been pushing his magical development toward a very specific channel, the way you might train a vine against a trellis, for the entirety of his life. Remove it, and his magic would not simply be freed. It would have to find its own direction for the first time. She looked at Harry. He was watching her with those very green eyes. "The last one," she said, "will feel different when it goes." "Different how?" "Like standing up after being told all your life to sit down." He thought about that. "Okay," he said. Celeste let the last of her fire come. The 45th charm didn't dissolve like the others. It shattered. There was no other word for it, a clean, total, instantaneous fracture that sent a shockwave of released magical energy through the cupboard, through the hallway, through the walls of number 4 Privet Drive, and, she would learn later, through approximately a 12-block radius of residential Surrey, causing every light on the street to blow out simultaneously and making the cat next door, which had definitely been an animagus, bolt into the night at a speed that suggested sudden urgent business elsewhere. Harry Potter sat in the middle of it and breathed. The magic coming off him now was, Celeste, who had chosen her words carefully for over a century, sat for a moment in the wreckage of 45 charms and looked at this small, messy-haired, too-thin child and thought that the only word that fit was magnificent. Not because it was large, though it was. Because it was entirely, completely, for the first time, his. He lifted his hand and looked at it. The air around his fingers shimmered faintly, the way air shimmers above hot pavement. "I can feel everything," he said, quietly. Not frightened. Wondering. The whole house. The garden. There's a fox 3 streets over. He paused. There's a man watching our street. He's been there for, he frowned, a long time. He doesn't feel right. No, said Celeste. He is a watcher. He reports on you. Harry absorbed this with the same calm he had shown since waking. Then, who are you? My name is Céleste Beaumont. I am French. I am a Veela. She paused. I am very old and I am very tired of seeing children in cages. Oh. He looked around the cupboard with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not self-pity. More like, inventory. As if he was seeing it for the first time with accurate eyes. It is a cage, isn't it? Yes. I used to think everyone lived like this. I know. But they don't. No, she said. They do not. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her with a directness that she would come to think of, over the years, as simply Harry, the quality of his attention when something mattered to him, which was unflinching and warm and slightly unnerving. Are you taking me somewhere else? That, said Celeste, depends. On what? On whether you want to go. Something crossed his face then, something quick and bright that her fire recognized immediately, because she had felt it herself, once, a very long time ago. The specific feeling of a door opening when you had spent so long staring at a wall that you had stopped imagining doors existed. Yes, said Harry Potter. I want to go. Petunia was in the kitchen when Celeste walked through, Harry trailing behind her carrying a pillowcase into which he had packed, with remarkable efficiency, the sum total of his possessions, 2 sets of overlarge clothes, a pair of trainers with a split in the sole, a broken toy soldier with no arms, and a library book about space that was 3 weeks overdue. Celeste observed this inventory and added another entry to the list of things she was going to feel later, when she had the privacy for it. Petunia looked at Harry. She looked at Celeste. Some calculation happened behind her eyes that Celeste watched without expression. He has to be back by, he does not, in fact, said Celeste pleasantly, have to be anywhere you require him to be. Ever again. You can't just, Mrs. Dursley, said Celeste, and she did not raise her voice, did not change its pitch, did not do anything so theatrical as let her fire show. She simply looked at Petunia Dursley with the full weight of something that had been old when the British Isles were a rumor. I have just removed 45 magical bindings from your nephew. Some were placed by people who are going to be very unhappy to learn that I've done so. They may come to you for explanations. She tilted her head slightly. Tell them the boy's grandmother came for him. Petunia opened her mouth. I am not, technically, his grandmother, Celeste added. But I find the word useful. She walked out of number 4 Privet Drive's front door, and Harry walked beside her, and neither of them looked back. On the street, Harry looked up at her. She was tall, most people were not taller than Celeste, and he had to tilt his head back to see her face. You said you were a Veela, he said. Yes. I've read about Veela. In one of the books at school. It said you were dangerous. We are, she agreed, walking. Are you dangerous to me? She considered the question as she walked, because it deserved a real answer rather than a reassuring one. I am dangerous to people who mean you harm, she said finally. Which is, I suspect, a different thing than you were asking. Harry thought about it. Yeah, he said. I guess it is. The Ministry liaison car was parked 2 streets over. The driver, a French Ministry official named Bernard who had spent the entire afternoon pretending to read a newspaper and had been waiting for Céleste with the trained patience of someone who had learned, over a long career, that when Madame Beaumont said she was going for a short walk it could mean almost anything, looked at Harry with carefully neutral surprise. We are making a stop, said Céleste, opening the door. Of course, madam, said Bernard. Harry got into the car and looked out the window at Privet Drive one last time. The lights were still out on the whole street. In the gathering dark, with the ordinary rows of tidy houses and the parked cars and the hanging baskets of petunias catching the last of the evening light, it looked exactly like what it was, a perfectly normal street on which something irreversible had just happened. He turned away from the window. Where are we going? He asked. To make a telephone call, said Céleste. And then to France. I've never been to France. No. But you will find, she said, settling into the seat with the air of someone who has delivered this verdict before and found it always accurate, that France agrees with you. The car pulled away from the curb. In the house behind them, Petunia Desley stood in her kitchen for a very long time, not moving, staring at the space where the cupboard door was still open, and she did not call the police or the ministry or anyone at all, because deep down in the part of her that had always known, she understood that something that had been wrong for a very long time had just, unexpectedly, been put right. 3 hours later, in the small hours of the morning in a Ministry Fleur office in London, Albus Dumbledore looked at the burnt remnants of 45 tracking notifications, each one connected to a binding charm that had just ceased to exist, and sat very still for a long moment. Then he reached for a quill. He had several letters to write, and none of them were going to be easy. The flight took no time at all from Harry's perspective, because Bernard turned out to have a charm on the car that made passengers fall gently asleep somewhere over the channel, and Harry, who had not in his memory ever slept in a proper bed or a comfortable seat, dropped off within minutes of the coast appearing through the window and didn't surface until the car was winding through French countryside in the early morning, the light gold and long and nothing like Surrey at all. He woke up and looked out the window and said nothing for several minutes. The fields were vast and rolling and very green, a different green than England, somehow richer, as if the color had been allowed to go as far as it wanted. There were sunflowers. There were old stone walls. There was a village that went past in approximately 4 seconds, all pale stone and red roofs and a church tower, and Harry watched it go with his forehead nearly against the glass. "What are you thinking?" said Céleste, who had not slept and was reading something that looked like a very official document with a lot of stamps on it. "It's so big," said Harry. He meant the sky, he thought, or maybe everything. The sense that the world was larger than Privet Drive had let him believe. "It is," she agreed. "It becomes bigger still, the more you move through it." The car turned off a main road onto a smaller one, and then off that onto something barely wider than a lane, and then through iron gates that opened as they approached, and up a long gravel drive lined with plane trees, and then Harry saw the house. It was not a castle. It was also not anything close to ordinary. It was a very old house, stone, low and long in the way of old French country houses, with faded green shutters and roses that had clearly been growing against the walls for approximately forever, and a garden that had the specific character of something that had once been formal and had, over generations, been allowed to become interesting. It sat in the early morning light as though it had always been there and expected to continue being there indefinitely. "This is where you live?" Harry said. "This is where my daughter lives," said Céleste. "And her family." As the car stopped, the front door of the house opened, and a woman came out. She was perhaps 30, with silver fair hair loose around her shoulders and the kind of beauty that makes you feel you should apologize for looking directly at it. She was wearing a dressing gown and an expression of controlled concern that shifted rapidly towards something more complex as she took in the sight of her mother stepping out of the car followed by a small, dark-haired, extraordinarily large-eyed child carrying a pillowcase. "Maman," said the woman, in French. "You said a diplomatic errand." "It was," said Céleste. And then it became something else. "Who?" The woman stopped. She was looking at Harry with an expression that Céleste recognized. She had raised this daughter, after all, and she knew what it looked like when Apollon felt her instincts fire. Apollon was 3/4 Veela. She couldn't read magical signatures with the clarity Céleste could, but she could feel the shape of a person's magic, and she was feeling Harry's now. "Maman," she said, more quietly. "What happened to him?" "I will explain inside," said Céleste. "He needs breakfast." Harry, who had been listening to this entire exchange with the focused attention of a child who doesn't speak French but knows the conversation is about him, said, "I can wait." Both women looked at him. "I can wait," he said again. "If you need to talk first." "I'm used to waiting." There was a silence. Apollon crouched down to his level, a fluid, natural motion, and looked at him directly. Her eyes were a blue that Harry had never seen outside of pictures. "You are not going to wait," she said. Her English was accented but clear. "You are going to come inside and eat something, and then you are going to sleep in a proper bed." She held out her hand. "I am Apollon." "You are?" "Harry," he said. "Harry Potter." If the name meant anything to her in this moment, she didn't show it. She simply took his hand and stood up. "Well, Harry. Welcome to the Delacour house. Come and meet the chaos." The chaos, it turned out, was 2 girls. The first one he saw was a small, round-faced creature of perhaps 3 who was sitting at the bottom of the stairs just inside the front door eating something off a spoon with tremendous concentration. She had silver blonde hair and her mother's blue eyes, and she looked up at Harry with the absolute guilelessness of a very small child encountering something new. "Who dat?" she said. "This is Harry," said Apollon. "Harry," repeated the small one, as if filing this for later use. She returned to her spoon. "That is Gabrielle," said Apollon. "She is 3 and she believes the world revolves around her breakfast." "She's not wrong," said a voice from the top of the stairs, and Harry looked up. The girl at the top of the stairs was 9, he thought, or thereabouts. She had the same silver blonde hair as her mother and sister, worn in a long braid over one shoulder, and she was standing at the top of the staircase with her arms crossed, looking down at him with an expression that he would later come to recognize as Fleur Delacour in assessment mode, which was not unfriendly, exactly, but was thorough, and gave you the feeling of being read more carefully than you'd expected. "Fleur," said Apollon, "come down and say hello properly." "I can say hello from here," said Fleur. She looked at Harry. "You are the boy Grandmere brought home." "I suppose so," said Harry. "Are you magical?" "Yes." "How old are you?" 7. She looked at him for a moment with her head tilted very slightly. Then she said, "You feel very big for 7. Harry blinked. What?" "Magically," she said, as if this were obvious, and came down the stairs. She was taller than him by a good several inches, which he supposed was fair since she was also 2 years older, and she stopped in front of him and looked at him with those direct blue eyes. Then she stuck her hand out in a way that was oddly formal for a 9-year-old in pajamas. "Fleur Delacour." He shook it. "Harry Potter." "I know," she said. "Grandmere talks about Britain sometimes. And I read." She said it the way some people say "I win," as a simple statement of fact. Then she dropped his hand, turned on her heel, and walked toward what he assumed was the kitchen. Over her shoulder she said, "Come on. I'll show you where the bread is." Harry looked at Apollon, who was watching her eldest daughter with an expression of affectionate resignation. "Go," said Apollon. "She will not bite." "Much." Harry followed Fleur Delacour into the kitchen, and Gabrielle followed Harry because apparently breakfast was now more interesting than the spoon, and Céleste came last, and Bernard the driver brought in Harry's pillowcase and left it by the door and drove away into the morning, and by the time the sun was fully up and the kitchen smelled of bread and coffee and something sweet that turned out to be jam made from the fruit of the garden, Harry had eaten more at one sitting than he could clearly remember eating ever before, and Gabrielle had decided he was her new favorite thing, and Fleur was asking him questions with the relentlessness of a very intelligent person who has identified an interesting subject, and Apollon was watching all of it from across the kitchen table with her coffee cup held in both hands, and Céleste was writing a letter. She wrote several, that morning. One to the French Ministry, which was straightforward. One to a particular person in the British Ministry who owed her a very old favour, which was less straightforward but would be effective. One to Albus Dumbledore, which was the shortest of the three and the most precise, and which said, in its entirety, "The boy is with me. He is well. He is going to remain well. If you would like to discuss the 45 binding charms you placed upon him in infancy, you are welcome to visit. If you come with the intention of removing him, you should know that I am in a very particular mood, and I have not burnt anything down since 1942, and I find I am feeling nostalgic. Céleste Beaumont P.S. He said the air feels bigger without them. You should think about that." She sealed it. She addressed it. She sent it with the house owl, who was elderly and self-important and carried official correspondence with the bearing of an ambassador. Then she put her hand around her own coffee cup and listened to the sound of her granddaughter interrogating a small English boy about the specifics of British magic as if conducting a very brisk oral exam, and the small English boy answering with a mixture of uncertainty and quiet precision that suggested he had been thinking carefully about the world around him for a long time, just without the tools to do anything about it, and she thought, good. And then she thought, this is going to be a fight. And then she drank her coffee, because a fight was fine. She had started one in 1942 and won it, and she was very well rested by comparison. Outside, the morning was golden and enormous and going about its business, entirely unbothered by the fact that several owls were currently winging their way toward London with messages that were, in their various ways, going to disrupt a very carefully maintained plan. The sunflowers in the garden faced the light. The roses against the house wall put out their smell with the extravagance of something that knows exactly what it's worth. Somewhere in the house, Gabrielle dropped her spoon with a clatter and announced something in rapid French that made Apollon laugh. Harry Potter sat at a kitchen table in the south of France with bread and jam and a cup of hot chocolate that Apollon had pressed on him without asking, and listened to the sounds of a house that was full of people and noise and light, and felt, for the first time in his clear memory, something he could not name but which occupied the same place in his chest where the bindings had been. He would figure out the word for it later. For now it was enough that it was there. Chapter 2, What burns clean 3 weeks into Harry's residence at the Delacour house, he accidentally set the garden on fire. Not the whole garden. Just a section of it, approximately 4 square meters of lavender hedge along the south wall, which had been minding its own business on a Tuesday morning when Harry had been practicing the wandless focus exercises Céleste had introduced the week before. The lavender went up fast, because lavender will, and made a smell that was honestly quite pleasant even as Harry stared at it in horror, and Fleur came around the corner of the house at a run, looked at the fire, looked at Harry, and said, "What did you do?" "I don't know," he said. "That's not good enough," she said. "Think backwards. What were you doing exactly when it happened?" He told her. She listened with her arms crossed in the way she had, head tilted, eyes sharp. Then she said, "You were trying to push the magic outward and it went sideways. Grandmere says that happens in the first month of unbound training. It's like a muscle that's never been used properly, it spasms." "Does it set things on fire?" "It sets different things on fire for different people," she said, and pulled out her wand. She had received it at 8, which was the French custom, from a wandmaker in Paris, and put the lavender out with a neat aguamenti. She looked at the smoking hedge for a moment. Grandmere's first unbound expression set a lake in Provence on fire. An entire lake. A pause. She does not talk about it, but Papa found the record in an archive once. That's reassuring, said Harry. It was meant to be, said Fleur, entirely seriously, and walked back toward the house. Over her shoulder, come in for breakfast. And don't stand near anything else flammable for the rest of the morning. This was, Harry was learning, how the Delacour house operated. Things happened, and then you had breakfast, and then you dealt with things. It was the most orderly chaotic household he had ever encountered, which admittedly was a very small sample size, but still. Apollon ran it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had grown up watching Céleste and had absorbed the lesson that competence was a form of grace. Jean-Pierre Delacour, Apollon's husband, Fleur and Gabrielle's father, a tall, dark-haired, good-humored man who worked for the French ministry in some capacity involving international magical sports regulation, had been home for Harry's first week, regarded Harry with immediate warm acceptance, and then left again for Brussels with the apologetic air of a man who wished his job did not require quite so much international travel. He sent letters that Apollon read at the breakfast table and that Gabrielle immediately tried to eat. Harry had been given the room that connected to the garden, a proper room, with a window that overlooked the plane trees, and a bed that was wide enough that he spent the first several nights sleeping only in the middle of it because he kept expecting walls. The room had bookshelves. The previous occupant appeared to have been interested in Muggle natural history, and Harry, who had no particular expectations about what his interests were supposed to be since no one had ever asked, discovered that he was deeply interested in natural history too, and worked his way through 3 volumes on European bird migration in his first fortnight. Fleur found him reading one of these at 2 in the morning on his 4th night. "You can't sleep," she said. It wasn't a question. She was standing in his doorway in her nightdress with a candle, because Fleur Delacour had, Harry was learning, an instinct for knowing when something was happening in her house. "I'm used to not sleeping much," he said. He'd been up since midnight, not from distress, simply from the fact that he had spent 7 years calibrated to the rhythms of Privet Drive, which had not included comfort, and his body was still catching up. She came in, sat on the end of his bed, and looked at the book. "Bird migration? It's interesting. They navigate by magnetic fields. They can feel the shape of the earth." She looked at him. "You feel like that," she said, thoughtfully. "Like something that's found north for the first time." Harry considered this. "Is that a good thing?" "Oui," she said simply, and took the book from him and began reading it herself, and they sat in comfortable silence for an hour until she fell asleep on the end of his bed with the book on her chest, and Harry carefully extracted it and put it on the shelf and left her there because waking her seemed impolite, and then lay in the dark and listened to the French countryside doing its quiet, enormous nighttime things outside the window, and thought that this was what houses were supposed to feel like, and that this specific feeling was so new it was almost painful. He named it, that night. What he'd been feeling since the kitchen that first morning. Safe. Céleste began his formal education on the Monday of his 2nd week. She had spent the first week watching him. This was something Harry figured out only in retrospect, that the apparently idle conversations over meals, the seemingly casual questions about what he knew and what he didn't, the afternoon she'd spent reading in the garden while he explored it and she'd never once appeared to look at him, were actually Céleste doing the most thorough magical assessment he would later learn she was capable of. By Monday she had a picture of exactly what 45 binding charms had and hadn't allowed to develop, and she began from there. They worked in the large flagstoned room at the back of the house that everyone called the salle de pratique, which Apollon sometimes used for her own practice but which Céleste had claimed for the foreseeable future. It had very thick walls and the flagstones were, Céleste mentioned once, capable of withstanding significant magical output, which Harry found either reassuring or worrying depending on his mood. Céleste did not teach the way Harry would come to understand teachers usually taught. She did not begin with theory and then demonstrate. She began by asking him to do something he had no framework for, watched what happened, and then built the framework around the result. "Move that chair," she said, on the first morning, gesturing to a wooden chair against the far wall. Harry had never moved anything without touching it. He'd done accidental magic, he knew that now, looking back at a series of inexplicable events at Privet Drive that Aunt Petunia had punished him for, but he'd never tried deliberately. He looked at the chair. He thought move at it with the particular focused sincerity of a child who takes requests seriously, and the chair didn't move. He thought harder. Nothing. Stop thinking, said Celeste. How am I supposed to? Stop thinking about the chair, she said. Think about where you want it to be. Harry shifted his attention. Not the chair. The space by the window. He felt something adjust in him, not dramatically, just a small reorientation, like turning your head slightly, and the chair slid across the flagstones and came to rest exactly by the window with a gentle wooden sound. He stared at it. Good, said Celeste. Now do you understand the difference between those two approaches? The first one was pushing, he said slowly. The second one was, making space. Intention versus force, she said. Magic responds to will, not effort. Effort is what you use when you cannot find the will. Most wizards spend their entire careers using effort because they are never taught to find the will. This is a significant waste. She sat down across from him. Your power is not the point. It has never been the point. Anyone can be given power. What matters is whether you understand what you're doing with it. This was the framework of everything she taught him. Not more magic, but clearer magic. Not raw power, but precise intention. She taught him the theory she had learned over a century of practice, translated it into terms a 7-year-old could grasp by the simple method of not condescending to him, and Harry absorbed it with an appetite that she watched with satisfaction and occasional amusement. He was fast. Genuinely fast, not in the flashy sense of a child who performs tricks for approval, but in the deeper sense of someone whose instincts had been starved for years and were now eating everything in reach. He made the connections she gave him and extended them on his own, and he would come to her the next morning with questions that showed he'd been lying awake following the logic wherever it went, and she would answer those questions and give him 3 more. Fleur watched all of this from various doorways and didn't always bother to pretend she wasn't watching. She was 9, and sharp, and had been studying magic formally since she was 6, and she was not unaware that Harry was working at a pace that was, in certain areas, closing the 2-year gap between them faster than was entirely explicable by simple diligence. He's not going to be better than me, she told Gabrielle one afternoon, which was possibly unfair as an audience since Gabrielle was 3 and had recently become very interested in a caterpillar. "Harry," agreed Gabrielle, who apparently thought this was a positive statement. "That is not what Fleur stopped. Never mind." She went and found Harry in the salle de pratique, where he was doing something with water from a large ceramic bowl that she had never seen Celeste teach him. "What is that?" she said. "I don't know," he said, without looking up. The water was moving in a slow spiral, following the path of his attention around the bowl. "It just happened. I was thinking about how birds navigate by magnetic fields and I started thinking about how water moves and then this started. That's hydrokinesis. It's a rare wandless discipline." She sat on the workbench. "Show me." He looked up. "Show you how?" "Show me how you're doing it. Describe the feeling." So he did, and she listened with her full Fleur Delacour attention, which was considerable, and then she tried it herself, and the water did nothing whatsoever, and she sat back and made a face that he was learning to read as "I find this annoying but I respect it." "It's not something everyone can do," he said carefully. He was already developing the social intelligence to understand that Fleur's pride was not fragile, it was enormous, but that there was a difference between being good at something and rubbing it in. "I know that," she said. "I'm not upset. I'm interested." She tapped her finger against the bowl rim. "Grandmere says every magical person has a dominant element. Mine is air. Wind and light and heat, Veela things." She looked at the water. "Yours might be water." "What about the lavender?" he said. You were panicking then. Panic defaults to fire in most people. She looked at him with that tilted head assessment. What do you feel most natural with? He thought about it seriously. Water, he said. And earth a bit. Growing things. He paused. I can feel the garden. Like, I know where everything is. Fleur was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's not a normal thing. No? Grandmere has a word for it. She'd want to know. She stood up. Come on. Celeste listened to Harry's description with the expression she wore when she was thinking at full speed, very still, eyes focused somewhere past the middle distance. When he finished she said, feel the garden. Right now. What can you tell me about it? Harry let his attention spread outward. It was easier every day, this spreading, like a muscle that was getting its first real use after years of being bound. He felt the garden in layers, the soil first, warm and rich and threaded through with root systems that formed a network he could trace the way you trace a map with your finger. The old roses against the wall, deep-rooted and certain. The herb garden near the kitchen, more volatile, shallower. The plane trees along the drive, vast and settled, communicating something slow and absolute through their root systems that felt like, there are messages in the trees, he said, slightly startled by his own statement. Celeste made a sound. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition. The lavender you burned, she said. It is still in distress. Can you feel it? He reached for it. The section of hedge he'd burned was there, and it felt wrong, and then as he paid attention to it, as he let his awareness rest on it with intent, he felt something extend from him to it without his having decided to do it, warm and deliberate, like water finding a dry place. The damaged lavender wasn't healed. But it was, comforted, somehow. Acknowledged. Harry, said Celeste. Do you know the word druid? He didn't. She explained it, briefly, the old tradition of magical practitioners who worked in deep communion with living things rather than against them, who understood magic as something native to the world rather than imposed on it. She told him it was a practice nearly extinct in modern magical Britain, regulated out of existence by a ministry that didn't understand it and therefore feared it. She told him the French tradition had maintained it marginally better, but only just. He started. You have the instinct, she said. Whether you develop it is a choice. But the instinct does not lie. She looked at him steadily. Nothing about you lies, Harry. That was the most offensive thing about those binding charms. They were trying to make you into a specific kind of person. They were not going to succeed, because what you actually are was too fundamental to redirect, but they were going to make you a very confused, very limited version of it. What was someone trying to make me into, he said. The question sat in the room. Celeste considered, for a moment, how much to say to a 7-year-old. Then she looked at him, really looked, with the full weight of everything she was, and remembered that this was not an ordinary 7-year-old, and that treating him as one in order to protect him was precisely the same instinct that had put those charms on him in the first place. A weapon, she said. Well aimed. Pointed at a specific target. Designed to go off at a specific time. Voldemort, said Harry. She didn't flinch. She had noted, with approval, that he used the name without hesitation. Yes. And after? She looked at him. What was I supposed to do after, he said. After the weapon part. That, said Celeste, is what no one had planned for. She paused. Which is, I think, partly why 45 charms were necessary. What you are, without them, is not a thing that fits into someone else's plan. Harry sat with this for a moment. Then he said, I don't mind fighting Voldemort. No? If someone has to, I don't mind that it's me. But I want it to be because I chose it. He looked at his hands. The air around them shimmered faintly, as it sometimes did now. Not because they made me into something that couldn't do anything else. Celeste was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she said finally. That is exactly the difference. Apollon, in the 4th week, sat down with Harry after dinner when the girls were in bed and Celeste was writing more of her correspondence. Celeste was always writing correspondence, to people across Europe and a few further afield, and Harry had begun to understand that the Beaumont Delacour women existed at the center of a network that was considerably larger and older than anything the British Ministry of Magic dreamed of. "How are you sleeping?" Apollon asked him. "Better," he said honestly. "Are you happy here?" He thought about it in the way he'd learned to think about things, genuinely, carefully, without the defensive speed of someone who has learned to give the answer that gets them left alone fastest. "I think I'm not sure yet what happy feels like," he said. "But I feel, right. Like this is where I'm supposed to be." He paused. "I know that's a strange thing to say about a place I've only been for a month." "Not strange at all," said Apollon. She wrapped both hands around her wine glass and looked at him with an expression that he was learning was her thinking face. "I want to talk to you about the practical things. Your schooling, Beauxbatons accepts students at 11, as does Hogwarts. You are 7 now, so we have some years. In the meantime, Celeste will teach you magic, and I will arrange tutors for the rest." She smiled slightly. "Fleur will also teach you things, whether you ask her to or not." "I know," said Harry, and smiled back. "She likes you," said Apollon. "She would not tell you this, because Fleur's version of liking people involves testing them to find their limits. But she likes you." A pause. "She brought you a book this morning. She said she'd already read it and didn't need it." "She has 3 copies," said Apollon. Harry looked down at the table. "There is one other thing," Apollon said, more carefully. "My mother's letter to Dumbledore. He has replied." The room shifted slightly. Not physically, but Harry felt it, the way he now felt everything, a change in the quality of the air, a tightening. "What does he say?" Apollon set her wine glass down. "He says he is glad you are safe. He says he would very much like to discuss the situation in person. He says," she paused, choosing her words, "that there are considerations relating to your safety that he would like to make sure are being properly accounted for." "He wants me back," said Harry. "He wants," said Apollon carefully, "to be in control of what happens to you. I do not think he wants to hurt you. I think he is a man who believes very strongly that he is the only person capable of handling certain things, and that this belief has led him to make choices about other people's lives that he had no right to make." She looked at Harry steadily. "My mother has written back to tell him he is welcome to visit." "She's not afraid of him," said Harry. It was not a question. "My mother," said Apollon, "has not been afraid of anyone for approximately 60 years. And that is not because she is reckless." She picked up her glass again. "It is because she is very good at being what she is, and she knows it, and she sees no reason to pretend otherwise." Harry absorbed this. "Is he going to come?" "Eventually," said Apollon. "Men like Albus Dumbledore always come. They cannot help it. Not knowing what is happening is more uncomfortable for them than any confrontation." "When he does," said Harry, "I want to be there." Apollon looked at him. He met her eyes steadily. "He made choices about my life," Harry said. "I think I have something to say about that." After a long moment, Apollon nodded. "I will tell Maman," she said. What happened in Harry's 2nd month was that his magic stopped being a spasm and became a language. It was Fleur who put it that way, which was characteristic of her. She had a precision with words that matched her precision with everything else, and she could find the right framing for a thing when Harry was still trying to describe what it felt like. They were in the garden on a Wednesday afternoon, the summer heat thick and lavender-scented and unmoving, and Harry had been practicing what Celeste called environmental awareness, which meant sitting very still and letting his perception extend outward in every direction at once. You look like you're asleep, said Fleur, who was lying in the grass nearby reading a very dense book about transfiguration theory. I'm working, said Harry. What does it feel like? Like, everything is speaking at once, but I'm learning to hear individual conversations. He opened his eyes. The old rose by the wall is very old. Older than the house, I think. It knows the shape of the land going back, he paused, feeling for it, a long time. Before the house was built. Can it tell you things about the past? Not in words. In feelings. In the quality of things. He frowned. I don't know how to explain it better than that. You don't have to, she said. She turned a page. It's like how I understand wind. I can feel a storm coming 3 days before anyone else because I feel it in the currents, not as facts but as a kind of knowing. She looked at him over her book. Our magic is our sense of the world. Most wizards use theirs only as a tool. We're learning to use it as a perception. Harry looked at her. Who taught you to think like that? Grandmere. A pause. And a lot of reading. She looked back at her book. Your English is already better than it was in the first week. I've been practicing, he said. He had also, in fact, been picking up French faster than he'd expected. Something about the way magic worked, he suspected, had opened certain channels. He was not fluent, but he was functional, and improving. Your French is appalling, said Fleur. It's better than it was. That is the lowest possible bar. But she said it without heat, and he could see, very faintly, the corner of her mouth doing the thing it did when she was suppressing a smile. He had learned all of Fleur's suppressed expressions. There were more of them than you'd expect. She wore the direct, confident face as the public presentation, and the suppressed ones were all for private, and there was a hierarchy of them that he was slowly mapping. Fleur, he said. What's your magic like? When you do it. What does it feel like to you? She set her book down then, which meant he'd asked something that required her actual attention. She lay in the grass looking up at the sky, and he waited, because he'd learned she needed a moment when a question was real. Like being entirely on fire, she said finally. But the fire is the truest version of what I am. When I do magic, particularly Veela-based work, not wand work, that's different, it feels like stopping pretending. She paused. Like I spend all the time in between trying to be an appropriate size, and then when I let the magic work, I'm allowed to be actually large. Harry understood this immediately and completely. Yes, he said. Yes, exactly. She turned her head to look at him. Their eyes met and something passed between them that neither of them had words for yet, being 7 and 9 respectively, but which was very real and very specific, the particular recognition of finding someone who understands the texture of your experience, not because they're the same as you, but because they're similarly and differently themselves. We should probably go in, said Fleur. Grandmere said dinner at 7. 3 more minutes, said Harry. She picked her book back up. Fine. 3 minutes. They stayed for 15. In August, a ministry owl arrived, forwarded through 3 different routes with enough redirection charms on it that it took Celeste considerable time to unpack its routing. When she did, she found a very careful, very official letter from a specific department within the British Ministry of Magic, not Dumbledore, not anyone she'd written to, inquiring, in excessively polite language, as to the whereabouts of a ward of the Ministry of Great Britain and whether international magical protocols had been observed in his recent relocation. She read this letter in the kitchen with her second cup of coffee. Harry was in the garden. Apollon was upstairs. Celeste set the letter on the table and thought about the 18 binding charms that had not matched Dumbledore's signature or the Ministry's standard work. She thought about the care with which Harry's magical development had been not just suppressed but redirected. She thought about a 7-year-old who had described freedom as the air getting bigger. She picked up her quill. She wrote the French Ministry of Magic's head of magical law. She wrote the Veela Council of Europe, of which she was a senior member and the oldest living charter signatory. She wrote 2 Gringotts cursebreakers she had used before, with a very specific request. And she wrote, last, a retired Auror in Edinburgh named Moody, who was not retired so much as he was discreet, and who owed her something older and more significant than a favor. The letters went out. Celeste finished her coffee. Outside, in the garden, Harry was sitting with the roots of the old rose, learning its long, slow language. The morning light came through the plane trees in long golden bars and moved on his face as the leaves moved above him, and Gabrielle came toddling around the corner of the house and sat next to him without invitation and began talking to him in the rapid, unself-conscious French of a 3-year-old who assumes the universe speaks her language. Harry listened. He understood about 1 word in 5. He responded in halting French and careful gestures, and Gabrielle accepted this completely, and they sat together in the garden in the morning light, and somewhere in the house Fleur was reading, and somewhere in the house Apollon was humming something to herself, and Celeste was building, letter by letter, the structure of a defense around this boy that no set of binding charms was ever going to touch again. It was, all things considered, a very fine summer in the south of France. The first time Harry's magic expressed itself at full, unchecked intensity was the last week of August. He had been in the salle de pratique alone. Celeste had given him a free afternoon, which she did periodically and which Harry had learned to use as genuinely unstructured practice time rather than supervised exercises. He had been working with water again, which was his most natural medium, moving it in complex patterns through the air with the spiral and flow technique he'd been developing on his own. The light was coming through the high windows in the angled way of late afternoon, and the room was warm, and he was content, he thought. Centered. The specific state that he was learning to recognize as the optimal condition for doing something real. He had been thinking about the magical bindings. Not obsessively, he didn't dwell, it was one of the things Celeste had noted about him with quiet approval, but with the analytical interest he brought to most things. He had been thinking about the fact that 45 charms had been placed on him before he could walk, and what that said about how afraid someone had been. Not of Voldemort. Of him. The water in the air above him formed itself, without his deciding it, into something. Not a shape he'd intended. The spiral had been moving in a slow, meditative pattern, but now it organized itself into a structure, concentric rings, intersecting, a geometry that felt ancient and deeply familiar even though he had never consciously learned it. It hung above him in the late afternoon light, lit from within, water and light together, turning slowly. He looked at it. He felt that it was somehow connected to the druidic instinct Celeste had named in him, felt that it was a real working, not an exercise. A structure of intent and power that existed in 3 dimensions and was complete. Whole. A thing in itself. Then the door to the salle de pratique opened and Fleur stopped dead in the doorway. She stood there for a long moment, looking up at the water structure turning in the light above Harry's head. Her expression went through several rapid iterations before arriving somewhere he didn't have a word for. "Harry," she said, very quietly. "Yeah," he said. "You know what that is?" "No," he said honestly. "It's called a circle de vérité," she said, without moving from the door. "A truth circle. It's very old magic. Druidic and older. Grandmere has a picture of one in one of her books." A pause. "It took the person in the picture 40 years of practice to make one." Harry looked up at it again. "I wasn't trying to." "I know," said Fleur. "That's rather the point." She came in then, slowly, into the room, and stood underneath the slowly turning structure and looked up at it. The light it made played across her face, silver gold, moving. "It's beautiful," she said, which was a purely honest observation and therefore all the more striking coming from Fleur, who did not offer assessments she didn't mean. "Should I put it down?" he said. "In a minute." She kept looking at it. "How does it feel?" "Like something I've been trying to say for a long time," he said, "and I finally found the words." She looked at him then. Long enough that he felt it, which was a new thing. He was becoming more sensitive to the attention of people he cared about, to the specific texture of it when it was genuine. Fleur's attention was always genuine. It was one of the things he trusted most about her. "Grandmere needs to see this," she said. "I know," he said. "She's going to have a lot of questions." "I know. You're not worried about that?" He thought about it. 7 years old, in a room in the south of France, with a working he hadn't meant to create turning in the air above him and the most certain sensation in his chest that he'd felt yet, that same word. Safe. And something new alongside it. Something that was the feeling of being exactly what you were, without any of the 45 reasons you were supposed to be less. "No," said Harry Potter. "I'm not worried about anything anymore." Fleur looked at him for one more moment. Then she smiled, a real one, not the suppressed kind, the actual kind, which he had seen perhaps 3 times and which transformed her face from striking to something that didn't have a standard word. "Good," she said. And went to get Celeste. Chapter 3. The weight of old names. Dumbledore arrived on a Thursday in early September, which meant the summer was just barely over and the plane trees along the drive were starting to turn at the edges, gold creeping into green with the particular reluctance of things that know what comes next but aren't quite ready. Harry saw him from the upstairs window first. He'd been up there reading. Celeste had given him a dense French text on elemental theory that he was working through with a dictionary and considerable stubbornness, when he felt the wards at the gate react. Not loudly. The Delacour estate wards were Celeste's work, built over decades and far more sophisticated than anything that announced itself with bells or alarms. They simply shifted. The way the surface of water shifts when something large moves beneath it. Harry put down the book and went to the window. The man walking up the drive was old. That was the first thing. Old in a way that was different from Celeste's agelessness, where she wore her centuries like something earned. This man wore his age the way a very tall building wears its height, as if it had accumulated somewhat beyond the original plan. Long silver beard. Half-moon spectacles. Robes of deep purple that would have looked theatrical on anyone else and on him looked simply like the clothes he'd always worn. He walked with a staff rather than leaning on it, which was a distinction Harry noted with the attention he gave to everything now. He moved, Harry thought, like someone who was used to arriving places and having things rearrange themselves around him. Fleur appeared in his doorway. "He's here," she said, which was unnecessary but which Harry understood to mean "Are you ready?" "Yes," he said, and put down the dictionary too. Celeste received Dumbledore in the formal sitting room, which Harry had been in only twice before. It was used for occasions that required a specific quality of seriousness, furnished with old things that had the particular gravity of objects that have witnessed a great deal of history and taken notes. Apollon was already there when Harry came in, sitting in the chair to Celeste's left with the composed expression she used when she was feeling something she didn't intend to display. Fleur had positioned herself near the window with a book she was not reading. Dumbledore was already seated across from Celeste. He looked up when Harry entered, and his expression did something complicated and quick: surprise, Harry thought, and something else that was harder to name. Not guilt. Not quite. The expression of someone recalculating. "Harry," said Dumbledore. His voice was warm, measured, practiced. "My dear boy." "Professor Dumbledore," said Harry. He sat down in the chair between Celeste and the window, which put him between the two of them, which he'd thought about on the way down. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at Dumbledore directly. Dumbledore's eyes, very blue, very sharp behind the half-moons, moved between Harry and Celeste with the quick interest of a man who was already assembling information. "You look well," he said to Harry. "I feel well," said Harry. "Better than I've ever felt." "I'm very glad to hear it." A pause that was too studied to be natural. "Though I confess the manner of your relocation has caused some concern among those responsible for your welfare." "I wasn't aware anyone was responsible for my welfare," said Harry. "Given the cupboard." The room went very quiet. Dumbledore's expression did not change, exactly, but something behind it shifted, and Harry watched it happen with the calm attention he'd been developing all summer, feeling the texture of it, the way you feel the weather shifting in the air before the rain arrives. The old man had not expected this. Not this directness, not this composure. He had been expecting, Harry realized, a 7-year-old. Some version of one, at any rate. The arrangements at your aunt's home were, Dumbledore began. 45 binding charms, said Harry. Placed on me before I could walk. Maintained regularly. Some of them are yours. Another silence. Longer this time. Harry, said Dumbledore, and now his voice had shifted too, gentler, the kind of gentle that is also a form of management. Those charms were placed with your safety very much in mind. There are forces, I know about Voldemort, said Harry. He said the name easily, the way Celeste had taught him to say it, not with bravado, not as a performance of courage, but as a simple noun, the name of a thing that existed and could be named. I've known about him since I was old enough to wonder about my scar. The bindings weren't protecting me from Voldemort. They were shaping me. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he looked at Celeste. You've been thorough, he said to her, and it was not quite an accusation and not quite a compliment. I have been honest, said Celeste, which is a different thing. She was sitting very still with her hands resting on the arms of her chair, which was the posture Harry had come to recognize as Celeste at her most formidable, not active, not displaying anything, simply present in a way that made the room aware of her. He asked me questions. I answered them. I find this preferable to the alternative. He is 7 years old, said Dumbledore. He is a person, said Celeste. Of 7 years. The age does not change what he is owed. What he is owed, said Dumbledore, with a patience that was beginning to show its edges, must be balanced against what he needs, and what he needs, Celeste, if I may, is to grow up without the weight of a war on his shoulders. He already has that weight, said Apollon, from her chair. Quietly, precisely. He was born with it. You placed it there, Albus. The question is not whether he carries it but whether he carries it knowing what it is. Dumbledore turned to Apollon with the expression of someone recalibrating which people in this room he needed to manage, and finding the answer was all of them, which was not what he'd planned for. The prophecy, he started. The prophecy, said Harry, says the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the 7th month dies. That's me. It also says neither of us can live while the other survives. He paused. I've been thinking about what that means. I don't think it means what you want it to mean. Dumbledore was very still now. I think, said Harry, that you heard the prophecy and decided it meant I had to be prepared to die. And then you decided that a boy who was prepared to die had to be built a certain way. Not too confident. Not too powerful. Not too aware of his own worth. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. He was not angry. He was clear. The way everything had become clear since August, since the Cercle de Verite, since Celeste had finished taking apart the last of what had been built around him and he'd had 6 weeks to discover what he actually was. You were making a sacrifice. You needed it to be willing. And you needed it to not know it had a choice. The silence this time was a different quality. Older. Heavier. Dumbledore took off his half-moon spectacles and held them. It was the first uncertain gesture Harry had seen from him, and he noted it not with satisfaction but with the specific sadness of recognizing that a person you've given weight to is smaller, in one particular way, than you'd thought. You are a remarkable child, Dumbledore said, quietly. I'm not trying to be remarkable, said Harry. I'm trying to be honest with you. Because I think someone should be. He leaned forward slightly. I'm not going to be a weapon, Professor. Not yours, not anyone else's. But that doesn't mean I won't fight Voldemort. I will. Because he hurts people and someone has to stop him and I probably have more ability to do it than most. A pause. I just want to do it because I chose to. Not because you built me into something that couldn't choose. Dumbledore put his spectacles back on. He looked at Harry for a very long time. The blood wards, he said finally. At your aunt's house. They offered real protection, Harry. Lily's sacrifice, the magic she left behind, I know about the blood wards, said Harry. Celeste explained them. They were real and they were valuable. He held Dumbledore's gaze. But they didn't require 45 binding charms. And they didn't require the cupboard. Those were choices someone made. Maybe you, maybe others. But someone looked at me in that house and decided a small frightened child was a useful condition for me to be in. I never, Dumbledore stopped. Started again. Harry. I never wanted you to be frightened. I know, said Harry, and he meant it. I think you wanted me to survive. I think you wanted Voldemort stopped. I think you decided I was the best tool for doing that and then you managed the tool. He sat back. I'm telling you now, face to face, so there's no misunderstanding, that's over. I'm not a tool. I'm going to stop Voldemort because I've decided to, and I'm going to do it my way, and the things I'm being taught here are already beyond what those bindings were going to let me reach. So you have a choice. Do I? Said Dumbledore, and it was not quite wry but it was in that direction. You can help, said Harry. Actually help. Tell me what you know about Voldemort, about the Horcruxes, a sharp intake of breath from Dumbledore. Something cracking in his composed expression. Yes, I know about those too, said Harry. Celeste's contact at Gringotts was very informative. You can tell me what you know and we can work together as equals, with information flowing both ways. Or, he paused, you can try to manage this, and we can both spend the next several years being less effective because of it. Dumbledore looked at Celeste. Did you tell him about the Horcruxes? Gringotts told him, said Celeste. I merely provided the introduction. She tilted her head. He is right, Albus. You know he is right. I can see it in your face, and I have known your face for 40 years, and you have never been able to lie to me convincingly. A reminder of why I've always found you somewhat alarming, said Dumbledore, very quietly. A pause. Then, slower, the Horcruxes are more complicated than even Gringotts may have indicated. I have been investigating for years. I believe there are 6. 7, said Harry. Dumbledore looked at him sharply. Voldemort wanted 7, Harry said. 7 is the most powerfully magical number. He wouldn't have stopped at 6. He made an attempt the night he killed my parents, and something went wrong, the killing curse rebounded and tore his soul. He hadn't finished the working. He paused. The 7th piece went somewhere he didn't put it intentionally. Dumbledore had gone very still again. How, he said carefully, do you know this? Harry touched the scar on his forehead lightly, once. He didn't say anything. The room held its breath. Dumbledore removed his spectacles again, which Harry was now identifying as his tell, the gesture he made when something had wrong-footed him entirely. He pinched the bridge of his nose. He sat with whatever he was feeling for a long moment, and Harry waited, because he'd found that when you'd said the important thing the only necessary next action was to let it sit. You understand, Dumbledore said finally, what that would mean. If you are correct. Yes, said Harry. I've had time to think about it. And you're not, Dumbledore looked at him, searching for something. You're not frightened? Of dying? Said Harry. A bit. But dying isn't the only option. It's just the option that requires the least creativity. He met Dumbledore's eyes squarely. I'm not a Horcrux to be destroyed, Professor. I'm a person who has a fragment of someone else's soul attached to him, and that's a curse-breaking problem, not a dying problem. Gringotts thinks it's possible to separate them. That has never been never been done, said Harry. Yes. That's what people said about removing 45 binding charms from an infant in one sitting too. Celeste, from her chair, said nothing. But Harry caught, in his peripheral vision, the absolute smallest curve of her mouth. Dumbledore sat back. He looked at Harry with an expression that had finally, mostly, set aside the management and the calculation and was doing something simpler and harder, actually seeing him. "I owe you an apology," Dumbledore said. "For many things. I am not certain I can make them sufficient. I believed I was doing what was necessary. I am not sure that belief excuses the choices it produced." "No," said Harry. "It doesn't. But I'm not asking for an apology." He paused. "I'm asking for information. And I'm asking you to stop making decisions about my life without me." Another pause. "And I'm asking you to tell me everyone whose signature was on those binding charms. Because yours and the Ministry's were not all of them." Dumbledore's face did something complicated again. "The other signatures," Harry said. "The 18 that weren't yours or the Ministry's. Who were they?" "That," said Dumbledore, "is a conversation that requires considerably more time. And preparation." "Then you'll come back," said Harry. It was not phrased as a request. Dumbledore looked at this 7-year-old boy, at his green eyes and his thin frame and his messy dark hair and the absolute settled quality of him, the complete absence of the fear and uncertainty and manageable brokenness that would have made this meeting easier, and he did something that Harry would remember for a long time. He laughed. Softly, genuinely, with something that might have been relief or recognition or both. "Yes," said Albus Dumbledore. "I will come back." After he left, after the wards rippled again with his departure, after the sound of the gate closing carried back up the drive, Apollon went to the kitchen to start dinner and Fleur put her unread book down and looked at Harry from across the room. "You knew about the Horcruxes before he said anything," she said. "Yes. You led him there on purpose. You wanted to see if he'd confirm it." "Yes," said Harry. "And the scar? I've been able to feel it since the bindings came off," he said. "Not loudly. But it's there. Something that isn't mine." He looked at her. "Celeste knows. Gringotts knows. We've been corresponding with a curse-breaker named Arbuthnot about it since July." "You didn't tell me," said Fleur. "I didn't want you to worry." She stared at him. "Harry," she said, with the particular precision she used when she was being very careful about her tone, "do not do that. Ever. I don't need protecting from information." "I know," he said immediately. "I'm sorry. It was a bad instinct. I've been around people my whole life who used information as a way of controlling things and yes. I'm sorry. You should have known." Fleur held his eyes for a moment to make sure he meant it, which he did, and then the tension went out of her shoulders. "What does Arbuthnot say?" "That it's theoretically possible to extract a soul fragment from a living host without killing the host," said Harry. "That no one has done it. That it would require ritual magic of considerable complexity and possibly a cooperation between druidic practice and Gringotts goblin curse-breaking that has never been attempted." He paused. "Celeste thinks we have at least 4 years before Voldemort is a real threat again. Possibly more. He's still very weak, the soul fragment I can feel is essentially dormant." "4 years," said Fleur. "You'll be 11. You'll be 13, he said. "Yes, thank you, I can do arithmetic." She picked up her book again, then set it down again, which meant she was still thinking. "The 18 signatures. The ones that aren't Dumbledore's or Ministry standard." "He knows who they are," said Harry. He was careful about that. "He knows, and it worries him enough that he didn't want to say it in front of everyone." "Dark magic," said Fleur. "Not standard darkness," said Harry. "The signatures were intentional. Skilled. Someone who understood soul magic and channeling magic. Someone who wanted specific things from me that weren't just suppression. He paused. Celeste wrote to someone about it. A retired auror. Moody, said Fleur, because she paid attention to her grandmother's correspondence more than most people realized. Yes. He's not retired, she said. I know. They sat in the late afternoon light of the sitting room and both of them were thinking fast and in slightly different directions, which was how they usually thought best, parallel tracks that intersected productively rather than two people trying to occupy the same mental space. It was, Harry had realized, one of the most functional things about how they worked together. Fleur would take a problem to its structural conclusion. He would take it to its human one. Somewhere between the two they usually found the actual answer. The other people who had binding charms on you, Fleur said finally. They're going to know those charms are broken. They already know, said Harry. They've known since July. Whatever they were going to do about it, they'd have started doing it. He looked at the window, at the plane trees turning in the light. The question is what they want. The Ministry ones are straightforward. They wanted me controllable. Dumbledore wanted me shaped toward a specific purpose. The 18, he stopped. The 18 wanted something specific from you, said Fleur. Something they needed from you being alive and developing a certain way. She met his eyes. Which means they're not going to try to hurt you. Not yet, said Harry. Not until you stop being useful to them, said Fleur. Right. So we need to know what they want before they decide to tell us, she said, which was perfectly logical and also, Harry thought, the kind of sentence that 10 years ago would have seemed insane to apply to a 7-year-old. He didn't say this. What he said was, yes. Grandmere, said Fleur, standing up. Grandmere, agreed Harry. They went to find her. Celeste was in her study, which was the room at the far end of the east wing that smelled of old paper and had the specific temperature of a room where a lot of serious work had been done over a long time. She was at her desk with 3 letters open in front of her and was not, apparently, surprised when both of them came in. Sit down, she said, without looking up. Both of you. I have been waiting for you to arrive at this conversation. They sat. Harry in the chair facing the desk. Fleur on the arm of the second chair, because Fleur rarely sat in chairs the way they were intended. The 18 signatures, said Celeste, and now she did look up, and her expression was the one she wore when things were important and she wanted to be precise. I have confirmed 3 of them. Moody confirmed 2 more this morning by owl. The working is consistent with a very specific school of magic, Old British nobility magic, the kind practiced by families who trace their lineage far enough back to predate the Hogwarts founding. She paused. The kind practiced by people who believe in something called the Legacy Compact. What's that? Said Harry. An old agreement, said Celeste. Predating the Ministry. When the wizarding world was still organized around bloodlines rather than institutions, the most powerful families made compacts with each other, agreements about how power would flow, who would inherit what abilities, how the magical bloodlines of Britain would be managed. She looked at Harry. The Potters were among those families. Ancient, significant, tied to the Druidic tradition. Harry was very still. The Legacy Compact, said Celeste, was a formal agreement that the Potter line's specific magical inheritance, the Druidic attunement, the elemental affinity, the particular kind of deep magic that your Cercle de Vérité demonstrated, would be preserved. Managed. Directed toward specific purposes by the compact families jointly. A pause. When James and Lily died, you became the last of that line. And the compact families, certain of them, decided that managing the inheritance meant managing you. Before I was walking, said Harry. Before you were walking, Celeste agreed. They put binding charms on an infant, said Fleur, and her voice had the specific quality it got when her temper was present but controlled, a kind of thermal compression. To shape an inheritance they believed belonged to them by old agreement, said Céleste. They would not see it as wrong. They would see it as stewardship. She folded her hands on the desk. This is the particular danger of people who have been powerful for a very long time. They become unable to distinguish between their interests and the interests of others, because the distinction has never been enforced. Who are they? Said Harry. The ones Moody confirmed. One is dead, said Céleste. One is in Azkaban. 3 are not. She paused. The 3 living ones are, a man named Aldrich Pruitt, who is a distant relation of the Weasley family and sits on the Wisengamot. A woman named Isolde Knott. And the head of a family called the Ravensworths, who have not been publicly active in 40 years but whose magical signature Moody says he has been watching for longer than that. Ravensworth, said Fleur. I've heard that name. You would have, said Céleste. They appear in any serious study of old British magical history. They were one of the 7 founding families of the Legacy Compact. She looked at Harry. They are also, according to Moody, connected to something that predates Voldemort. Something that Voldemort himself may be afraid of. The room absorbed this. That's why there were 18 separate charms, Harry said slowly. Not to suppress my magic. To claim it. To keep me developing in the direction they needed for something. Something that wasn't just about Voldemort. Yes, said Céleste. What do they need from me? He said. That, said Céleste, is what we are going to find out. She looked between the two of them, Harry, still and focused, Fleur, sitting on the chair arm with the contained intensity of someone who has just been given something to do. Moody is coming here next week. You will both be present. He is an unpleasant man but a very good one, and he knows things about the old families that no one else alive does. One question, said Harry. Yes. When I was talking to Dumbledore today, when I told him about the Horcrux in my scar, I watched his face. Harry looked at Céleste. He already knew. He suspected it, at least. He's known for a while. Yes, said Céleste. And he still thought I should die, said Harry. Not bitterly. Just, noting it, the way you note a fact that is also a kind of wound. He thought it might be necessary, said Céleste carefully. That's the same thing. Yes, she said, after a moment. It is. I'm not angry at him, said Harry. I want to be clear about that. He's trying to protect people. He just decided I didn't count as a people to be protected. I was a means. He paused. I don't think he even fully knew he was doing it. Fleur was looking at him with that expression she had, the one she only used when something he said had caught her somewhere real. The worst cruelties, said Céleste, are the ones performed by people who believe they are good. Because they never interrogate their choices. She looked at Harry steadily. You will encounter many such people in your life. They will tell you their intentions are pure. They may even be telling the truth. It will not change the fact that their choices caused harm. What do I do with them? Said Harry. You are honest with them, said Céleste. As you were today. You do not spare them the truth of what they did, but you do not turn them away if they can be useful and are willing to change. A pause. Dumbledore is one of the most powerful wizards alive. He knows things you will need to know. He is also, as you identified, guilty of serious choices regarding your life. Both of those things are true simultaneously. The ability to hold two true things that complicate each other, that is not a small skill, Harry. I know, he said. I've been practicing. Fleur made a sound that was specifically the sound she made when she was amused but didn't want to admit it. Go, said Céleste. Both of you. Dinner is in an hour. And Harry, he paused at the door. You did well today, she said. Not because you were clever, though you were. But because you were honest and you were fair, and those are harder. She held his gaze. Do not let anyone make you smaller than you are. But do not let yourself become larger than you are either. There is something very specific about your actual size. It is sufficient. You do not need more. He looked at her for a moment, at this ancient, formidable woman who had found him in a cupboard on a Wednesday in Surrey and set him on fire in the best possible way, and he felt the thing that was safe and also now the thing he'd identified as chosen, the feeling of belonging somewhere not because you had to but because it was real. Thank you, he said. For all of it. Go eat dinner, said Céleste. He went. Fleur fell into step beside him in the corridor, and they walked toward the kitchen where the smell of Apollin's cooking was already coming through the house, warm and rich and ordinary, and Gabrielle could be heard conducting what sounded like a very serious argument with a stuffed animal in the room above. Ravensworth, said Fleur. I'm going to look them up tonight, said Harry. I'll help. You don't have to. I know. She pushed open the kitchen door. I want to. They went in for dinner. Outside, the plane trees continued their slow turn toward gold, and somewhere in England an old man in purple robes was traveling home through the Fleur network thinking about a 7-year-old who had said dying isn't the only option, it's just the one that requires the least creativity, and writing very quickly in his private journal because he was, whatever else he was, a man who understood when something important had happened. And in a house in a part of England that was not on any ministry map, in a room that smelled of old magic and older ambition, a man named Aldrich Pruitt was looking at a dead binding charm, one of 18, all gone simultaneously, severed cleanly in July, and writing a letter of his own. To a person named Ravensworth. Whose full name was not, as it happened, a name anyone outside of certain very old circles would recognize. But would. Chapter 4, Letters written in ember. 4 years is a long time when you're growing into yourself. Harry turned 11 in the July of 1991 with the specific quality of someone who has been building towards something and knows it without being anxious about it. He was still lean, he suspected he would always be lean, it seemed structural rather than circumstantial, but he was no longer the too small, too quiet child from the cupboard. He stood straight. He took up the space he was entitled to. He had grown his hair out slightly because Fleur had told him once, with the complete candor she applied to all aesthetic observations, that it suited him better long enough to be interesting, and he'd filed that away and acted on it at his own pace. He spoke French now. Proper French, not functional French. The distinction mattered in the Delacour house, where language was treated as a form of respect rather than a utility. He'd also picked up a working knowledge of Italian from Celeste's correspondence with a contact in Florence, and more accidentally, enough gobbledygook to hold a basic conversation with Arbuthnot the Gringotts Cursebreaker, which Arbuthnot had found either impressive or alarming. It was difficult to tell with goblins. The Horcrux work was ongoing. Arbuthnot had confirmed the soul fragment in Harry's scar by the winter of his first year in France, using a diagnostic ritual that required 3 days of preparation and left Harry with a headache for a week. The fragment was stable and dormant. Voldemort was not sufficiently reconstituted to assert any meaningful influence through it. The complicated news was that extraction was going to require conditions that Arbuthnot described as theoretically achievable in the tone of someone who meant I have no idea but refused to say never. Dumbledore had returned 3 times over 4 years, each visit longer and more genuinely collaborative than the last. By the third he and Harry had developed something not quite friendship and not quite mentorship, most accurately described as a mutual project between people who respected each other's abilities while remaining clear-eyed about each other's failures. Information moved both ways. That had been Harry's condition and Dumbledore held to it. Moody visited every 6 months. He and Fleur had developed the kind of relationship that looked from the outside like comprehensive mutual antagonism and was actually heavily armored respect. The Legacy Compact research moved more slowly than any of them liked. Aldrich Pruitt remained on the Wisengamot, apparently unbothered, which Moody said was more alarming than activity would have been. Isolde not attended Wizarding Society events and smiled at people. Ravensworth remained invisible, which was, Celeste said, its own form of statement. Harry's magical education had, by this point, gone so far beyond standard ministry curriculum that the question of Hogwarts versus Beauxbatons was less about capability than about what kind of experience he wanted. He'd been thinking about it for months. The letter arrived on his birthday. 11 years old precisely, which was the standard timing. The Hogwarts admissions process was nothing if not punctual. He was sitting at the kitchen table eating breakfast with Gabrielle, who was now 7 and going through a phase of intense interest in Quidditch that she expressed primarily by narrating imaginary matches at the breakfast table to anyone in range. He looked at the Hogwarts seal on the envelope. The owl that had delivered it was regarding him with the professional detachment of ministry post. "Are you going to open it?" said Gabrielle. "I'm thinking," said Harry. "You think too slowly," said Gabrielle, and went back to her Quidditch commentary. He opened it. Read it. Set it down. Picked up his toast. Kept thinking. Fleur found him in the garden an hour later. She was 13 now, taller than him by a few inches still, though the gap was closing. She had her Beauxbatons uniform halfway on because she was leaving on Sunday to start her 3rd year and had apparently been doing a fitting of some kind upstairs. She sat beside him on the old stone bench by the rose wall. "Well," she said. "I don't know yet. What are the options as you see them?" "Beauxbatons," he said. "You're there. Céleste has the French ministry contacts. The teaching is better in certain areas. But the British ministry has jurisdiction over me, and fighting them on attendance at a foreign school is a whole issue." He looked at the rose. "Hogwarts. Dumbledore's there. The network I need to build is in Britain, the Wisingamot, the old families, the people who are going to matter when Voldemort returns. And it puts me closer to the Pruitts and the Knots." "That last one sounds like a reason to choose Beauxbatons," said Fleur. "It sounds like a reason to choose Hogwarts," said Harry. "I need to know them. I need to see how they move. Staying in France is staying outside the board." Fleur was quiet. He could feel her thinking, the specific texture of it, working through the angles, checking the structure of his logic, not for errors exactly but for things he might have missed. "You've already decided," she said. "I decided about 10 minutes into the thinking," he admitted. "Then what are you still sitting here for?" "I wanted to sit with it before I told Céleste," he said. "She's going to have opinions. She always has opinions." Fleur stretched her legs out in the morning sun. "She'll say Hogwarts is a good choice. She'll also say you should audit Dumbledore's involvement in your education and insist on certain conditions." "I know. I'm already planning that conversation." "What conditions?" "That my curriculum isn't standard," said Harry. "I'm 4 years ahead of first-year level in most practical areas. I'm not sitting through basic Wingardium Leviosa demonstrations." He paused. "Also that I have access to the restricted section without having to ask permission every time. And that Dumbledore shares whatever he finds about the remaining Horcruxes directly with me and not just with himself." Fleur tilted her head. "He'll agree to all of that." "I know. That's why I'm asking." He looked at her. "What I actually want from him is the thing he won't offer on his own. Access to the Department of Mysteries." Fleur looked at him. "The Soul Magic Division," said Harry. "They have records on Horcrux extraction going back 4 centuries. Arbuthnot's already tried twice to get them through normal channels and been blocked." He paused. "Dumbledore has clearance. He could get those records if he wanted to." "Then you ask for that too," said Fleur. "I will." He stood up. "Beauxbatons is better for you, for what you're building. The international connections, the IWSA contacts. You're going to be extraordinary at things that need a European platform." "I know," said Fleur, without false modesty, because she didn't deal in false modesty any more than she dealt in false anything. "I'm going to miss you being in the same building," he said. She looked at him for a moment with one of the expressions she kept for private, not the suppressed smile, something quieter. "You'll write," she said. It was not a question. "Every week," said Harry. "Every week," she agreed, and stood up and straightened her half-done Beauxbatons uniform with a brisk efficiency that was her version of closing a subject before it became sentimental. "Now go tell Grandmere. I want to see her face." Celeste's face, when he told her, was exactly what Fleur had predicted: approval, followed immediately by a list of conditions she expected him to establish, which matched his list almost exactly, except that hers also included "You will not allow Albus Dumbledore to use you as a forward position without your full consent and awareness," which Harry had already noted under a different heading in his own thinking but appreciated hearing stated explicitly. He wrote to Dumbledore that afternoon. The letter was polite, specific, and set out his conditions clearly. Dumbledore replied within 12 hours, which told Harry something about how closely the old man had been watching for this letter, agreeing to everything including, after a pause that Harry imagined was genuine deliberation, the Department of Mysteries records. He wrote to Gringotts. To Moody. To the Delacour family solicitor, a sharp-minded wizard in Paris named Theodore Beaumont, no relation to Celeste, which was a coincidence that Celeste found mildly irritating, regarding the formal status of his guardianship and whether the current arrangement had sufficient legal standing to withstand ministry interference. Theodore's reply came back in 2 days and said, essentially, yes, and also we have made it more standing in the last 4 years than you probably know, and also you should read this enclosed document which concerns your family vault. Harry read the enclosed document 3 times. Then he went to find Celeste, who was in her study as always, and stood in the doorway, and she looked up from her letters. "You knew," he said. "I suspected," she said, which was a technical distinction. "The Potter vault at Gringotts," said Harry. "It's not just money. No. It's a repository. For the Legacy Compact documentation. The original agreements, the spell records, the entire history of the compact going back 8 centuries. He came in and sat down. My father's family was one of the founding 7. And as the last Potter, I'm not just a subject of the compact. I'm a compact holder." "Yes," said Celeste. "Which means Pruitt and Knott and Ravensworth didn't just put binding charms on a Potter child," said Harry. "They put them on a compact holder. On someone who had legal and magical standing within the very framework they were using to justify their actions." He paused. "That's not just wrong. By their own rules, it's invalid. Possibly catastrophically so." "By their own rules," Celeste confirmed, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for a student to reach a specific conclusion. "The compact has a mechanism for this," said Harry. He was thinking fast now, the way he did when things connected, not excited, just aligned, the feeling of puzzle pieces finding their edges. A formal challenge. If a compact holder can demonstrate that another holder acted against the terms of the compact, the other holder's seat and entitlements within it are forfeit. He looked at her. "Pruitt has a Wisengamot seat that derives from his compact standing." "Yes," said Celeste. "So I could remove him from the Wisengamot," said Harry. "Legally. Using the system he used against me." "You could," said Celeste. "When you have assembled sufficient documentation of what was done and had it verified by Gringotts, which is the independent arbiter the compact specifies." "Arbuthnot," said Harry immediately. "Arbuthnot," agreed Celeste. "Which is why I introduced you 3 years ago." She tilted her head. "I did mention I planned ahead." "You did," said Harry, and felt the specific warmth he always felt in this room, in this house, with this woman, the feeling of being not just protected but equipped. Celeste. Thank you. Again. Still. "Go pack for Hogwarts," she said. "You leave in 3 weeks." He went to pack for Hogwarts. The 1st of September, 1991, arrived with the particular weather of England in autumn, grey, purposeful, smelling of wet stone and the specific democratic dampness of a country where the sky feels close. Harry stood on platform 9 3/4 and took it in with the interest of someone encountering a new environment rather than returning to a familiar one, because this was genuinely new. He had no memory of this platform, no privet drive history of dreading it, no narrative already attached to it. He was simply here, for the first time, seeing what it was. What it was: loud, crowded, genuinely chaotic in the specific way of a large population of magical children and their families compressed into a relatively small space. Owls. Cats. One very large toad that had escaped its carrier and was making excellent time toward the gap in the barrier. The smell of steam and cinders from the scarlet engine at the platform's end, which was more beautiful than he'd expected, genuinely beautiful, the deep red and gold of it, the white steam trailing back along the platform in the morning air. He had a trunk. He had Hedwig, his snowy owl, who had been a birthday present from Apollon and whose dignity was absolute. He had, in the inside pocket of his jacket, a list of things to observe in his first week written in Fleur's handwriting, which she had pressed on him the morning he left with the brisk efficiency of someone who knows a useful thing when they think of it. He did not have anyone he knew on this platform. This lasted approximately 4 minutes. "You're Harry Potter," said a voice. He turned. A red-haired boy about his height, freckled, with a smear of something on his nose that might have been ink. Friendly face, open expression, slightly breathless, recently run, possibly, or just generally operating at a higher energy level than average. "I am," said Harry. "I'm Ron. Ron Weasley." He stuck out his hand with the directness of someone who hasn't yet learned to be self-conscious about directness, which Harry appreciated. He shook it. "I've got 5 older brothers who've all been at Hogwarts, so I know pretty much everything about it if you've got questions." "I probably have different questions than you'd expect," said Harry. Ron blinked. "Right. Good different or weird different?" "Probably both," said Harry honestly. Ron considered this for a moment and then grinned, which transformed his face from merely friendly to genuinely warm. "Fair enough. D'you want to find a compartment? My brothers have all vanished off with their mates and I'm on my own." "Yes," said Harry. "Come on." They found a compartment toward the rear of the train, and Ron introduced himself properly: large family, ancient magical lineage, though he said it in the way people say things they've been told rather than things they've investigated, not much money, Gryffindor family through and through, worried about living up to his brothers. He had the particular quality of someone who had been slightly lost in a crowd his whole life and had responded by becoming very good at reading rooms and making people feel comfortable, which Harry recognized as the social skill of a second youngest sibling in a loud household. "What about you?" Ron said. "I mean, obviously I know of you. Everyone does. But what are you actually like?" "I've been living in France," Harry said. "With family friends. Since I was 7. "France?" Ron looked genuinely interested. "What's that like?" "Good," said Harry. "Warm. Better food than England." "My mum would argue that," said Ron, "but without heat." "Why France though?" I mean, wasn't Dumbledore looking after you? There were rumors you were with Muggles somewhere." "I was," said Harry. "Dumbledore had me with my aunt and uncle. It wasn't right. Someone fixed it." He said it simply, without drama, in the way he'd learned to talk about his history, not hiding it, not performing it, just stating it as a fact that had happened and been addressed. Ron's face did several things in quick succession: sympathy, curiosity, something that was beginning to be anger on Harry's behalf, and he said, "Right. Well. Good that someone sorted it." Then, with the social intelligence Harry was already identifying as one of Ron's genuine gifts, "Do you want to talk about it or shall we talk about something else?" "Something else," said Harry. "Tell me about Quidditch." Ron lit up so completely and immediately that Harry laughed, which was a real laugh, not a polite one, because the sheer unguarded enthusiasm of it was infectious. They talked Quidditch for 40 minutes. Harry knew more than Ron expected. Gabrielle had been an extremely thorough and unsolicited educator on the subject, and the conversation became a proper one rather than a tutorial, both of them trading opinions and disagreements with the ease of people who've discovered a shared language. The compartment door slid open halfway through a debate about seeker versus chaser as the most tactically significant position, and a girl with bushy brown hair and a purposeful expression looked in at them. "Has anyone seen a toad?" "A boy named Neville's lost one." "Platform," said Harry. "Last I saw it, heading for the gap in the barrier. Someone probably caught it before it got through." The girl blinked. "How do you know that?" "I felt it. Wide open spaces make toads uncomfortable. It would have slowed down once it hit the boundary ward and someone would have caught it." He paused. "You might want to check with the prefects." She stared at him for a moment with an expression he recognized, the specific look of someone who has just had their model of what a person should know about adjusted. "Right," she said. "I'll do that." She didn't leave. "I'm Hermione Granger. I've read about most of the spells we'll be learning already, and I've memorized Hogwarts, a history." "What year were you, Harry Potter?" he said. "This is Ron Weasley. Sit down if you want." She sat, with the air of someone accepting an invitation that was unexpected but logically sound. She was organized in the way of someone who manages anxiety through preparation, Harry thought, and very intelligent, and would need to learn at some point that intelligence and knowledge were related but not the same thing, but that was a long-term project and for now she was interesting company. The three of them talked until the train began to slow toward Hogsmeade, at which point Ron produced a bag of sweets from somewhere and shared them with the completeness of someone for whom food sharing is a primary social gesture, and Hermione told them both several facts about Hogwarts that Ron already knew and Harry found he mostly knew from Fleur's annotated list and Dumbledore's briefings, and Harry watched the lights of Hogsmeade begin to appear through the darkening window and felt ready. Not nervous. Ready. Hogwarts from the boats was better than he'd expected. He had expected impressive. It was, by all accounts, one of the most significant magical structures in Britain. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the quality of its presence, the way it sat above the lake with a weight that was more than architectural, the way the magic of the place reached down to the water and out into the dark air, old and specific and vast, the way it knew, in some slow foundational way, that a large number of magical children were arriving. He felt it the way he felt the garden in France, the way he felt the rose wall and the plane trees, not as a building but as a living system, ancient and aware. He let his awareness brush it lightly, the way you'd touch the shoulder of a very old dignified creature to let it know you were there. The magic of Hogwarts, somewhat to his surprise, brushed back. "You all right?" said Ron from the boat beside his. "Yes," said Harry. "I'm talking to the castle." "Right," said Ron, and paddled on, which Harry appreciated for its complete acceptance of the statement. The sorting was, logistically, a hat on a stool. Harry had known this in advance and had thought about it in advance with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, not what house he'd be sorted into, which he suspected he already knew, but what the sorting would mean in terms of the dynamics he was entering. Gryffindor was the most visible house, the heroic narrative one, the one the whole Voldemort prophecy story expected him to inhabit. Ravenclaw would suit him intellectually but would keep him at a certain remove from the social architecture he needed. Slytherin was genuinely considered, the ambition and the political savvy were there, and the legacy compact research suggested several important old families had strong Slytherin connections, but the current Slytherin culture was too saturated with blood ideology to be useful to him, and he had no interest in spending 7 years managing those dynamics. He sat on the stool. The hat came down. He felt it reach into his mind with the strange, tentative respect of something very old encountering something it wasn't sure how to characterize. "Interesting," said the hat, inside his head. "Hello," said Harry. "You've already decided," said the hat. "Yes," said Harry. "Gryffindor suits you," said the hat, "but not for the usual reasons." The courage isn't the interesting part. What's interesting is the honesty. Then we agree, said Harry. Gryffindor, shouted the Hat. The table erupted. He went and sat down, and Ron, sorted minutes later to the same table, dropped into the seat next to him with the expression of someone who had been hoping for this outcome and was pleased. Hermione Granger arrived at the same table shortly after and sat across from them and immediately started talking to the girl beside her about the castle's architectural history, which Harry found entirely in character and endearing. His first impression of Dumbledore, seen across the great hall from the high table, was that the old man looked relieved. Not just pleased. Genuinely, deeply relieved, in the way of someone who has been carrying a weight and found it reduced by something they hadn't anticipated. He caught Harry's eye briefly and gave the smallest nod, and Harry nodded back, and that was sufficient. The girl who sat on Harry's other side at the Gryffindor table introduced herself as Parvati Patil. Across from him, a sandy-haired boy named Neville Longbottom, who had, apparently, successfully recovered his toad, named Trevor, from the prefects, exactly as Harry had predicted, was looking at him with the wide-eyed recognition of someone who knows the name and is trying to reconcile the legend with the actual person. "Hi," said Harry directly to Neville, because he'd learned that the best response to that look was to make the first move. "I'm Harry. You look like you've had a complicated journey." Neville blinked. "Trevor got loose 3 times, he said." "Toads are like that," said Harry. "Mine was a cupboard when I was small. Everything escapes eventually." Ron snorted. Neville looked uncertain whether this was a joke. Harry smiled at him, and something in Neville's expression settled, the wide-eyed quality shifting toward something more ordinary and more comfortable. "Are you really?" Neville started. "Yes," said Harry. "But it's not the most interesting thing about me, I promise." The first week was, in practical terms, a managed disappointment. He sat through first-year lessons, charms, transfiguration, herbology, potions, and did the work, and did it well, because he'd been taught that doing the work was the point rather than the demonstration of it. Professor McGonagall, who taught transfiguration with the brisk efficiency of a person who had been doing it for decades and had very high standards and very low tolerance for wasted time, noticed on the second day that he was working 3 exercises ahead of the stated task and said nothing for a full lesson before catching him after class. "Mr. Potter," she said. "How long have you been studying transfiguration?" "For years," said Harry. "In France, mostly. Though I've been reading ahead in your syllabus since August." She looked at him over her square spectacles with the expression of someone revising an assumption. "Who taught you?" "A woman named Céleste Beaumont," he said. "She's a Veela. About 130 years old. She'd argue the teaching was incidental to the practice, but she's modest about it." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. "I know that name," she said carefully. "Most serious practitioners do," said Harry. "Professor, I spoke with Dumbledore before term about my curriculum. He mentioned you'd be the one to talk to about accelerated coursework." The expression on her face suggested Dumbledore had perhaps been slightly more casual with this information than was entirely fair. But he was already certain, the kind of person who respected directness, and she proved it by saying simply, "Come back Thursday at 5. We'll assess where you actually are and adjust accordingly." "And Mr. Potter, yes? Don't hold back in class because you think it's polite. It isn't. It's just inconvenient for the people trying to teach you." "Understood," said Harry. Potions was Snape. Harry had heard about Snape. Dumbledore had mentioned him with a careful neutrality that spoke to complicated history. Moody had said, with characteristic directness, "Watch that one, he's brilliant, he's loyal to the right side now, and he's also the kind of man who makes personal pain into a management style." Fleur had written, based on what she'd gathered from older Hogwarts graduates she knew at Beaux Batons, that he was a spectacular teacher if you can withstand the atmosphere, which is apparently that of a poorly ventilated dungeon in every sense. The man himself was tall, dark-haired, pale, with an economy of movement that suggested someone who had learned to take up very little space as a survival mechanism and had never quite lost the habit. He swept into the first potions lesson with the controlled theatrics of a person who had a very specific classroom presence and used it deliberately, and began with the traditional speech about the art and science of potion-making that Harry suspected he had given many times. Then he looked at Harry. "Potter," he said. "Our new celebrity." The class shifted. Harry felt it, the collective intake of breath, the attention swiveling, the anticipation of a performance. He looked at Snape with the steady, neutral attention he'd learned from Celeste, which was the opposite of a challenge and the opposite of submission and therefore, for someone like Snape, somewhat difficult to respond to in the expected way. "What would I get," Snape said, with the particular precision of someone who has found their rhetorical ground, "if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" "Draught of living death," said Harry. "One of the most powerful sleeping potions in existence. The ratio of asphodel matters considerably. A 1/15 of a gram difference in the powdering will alter the onset time without affecting the depth of the draught, which is relevant if you're trying to match it to a specific body weight." Snape was very still. "Where," he said carefully, "did you learn that?" "I've been studying potions for 4 years," said Harry. "With access to a library that includes pre-ministry texts." He paused. "Also, I read your paper on modifying the draught of living death base formula. It's in the restricted section at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. I thought the argument in the second section was correct and the proposed modification in the third was probably underdeveloped. The silence in the potions dungeon was the kind that has a texture." Snape looked at him. His expression had not changed, the dark eyes were exactly as unreadable as they'd been, but something in the room was different, in the way rooms are different when someone has stopped performing and started actually thinking. "My paper," said Snape, "was not published." "No," agreed Harry. "It was rejected by the British Potions Journal in 1983. The French archive acquired the manuscript from the editor's estate in 1987. He met Snape's eyes. "Your original argument was better than the revision you submitted later. I think they were wrong to reject it." Another silence. Then Snape said, "You will brew the standard first-year boil cure potion today," in a voice that was entirely level and told Harry nothing whatsoever about what he was thinking. "Without errors." "Of course," said Harry. He brewed it without errors. Snape marked his work without comment and swept on to the next student, and for the rest of the lesson treated Harry with the same precise, demanding attention he gave everyone else, no special hostility, no special favor. Which, Hermione told him afterward in a slightly odd tone, was not what Snape's lessons usually looked like for people who'd shown him up. "I didn't show him up," said Harry. "I told him his work was good." "That's different." "He doesn't usually receive that well," said Hermione. "He received it fine," said Harry. "He just needs time to decide what to do with it." He wrote to Fleur that evening, at the desk in his dormitory while Ron was playing Exploding Snap with Neville 2 beds over and making an extraordinary amount of noise about it. The letter covered the week's practical impressions, his initial read on the teachers, Ron's genuine warmth and quick strategic mind, Hermione's extraordinary retention and slight tendency to confuse competence with wisdom, Neville's deep knowledge of herbology that he was currently very shy about, and the specific quality of Hogwarts' magical presence, which he described as like a very large, very old person who has been taking care of things for so long they've stopped noticing they're doing it. He told her about the Sorting Hat's comment on honesty. He told her about McGonagall's Thursday meeting. He told her that the castle smelled like stone and old wood and something that might be the residual magic of 800 years of students, and that he'd felt it reach back when he'd touched it from the boats, and that he thought that was going to be worth investigating. He signed it, folded it, and gave it to Hedwig, who accepted it with the regal patience of someone who knew her route and found the whole enterprise somewhat beneath her capabilities. Ron looked up from Exploding Snap. "Who are you writing to?" "A friend in France," said Harry. "She's at Beauxbatons." "She?" said Ron, with the particular emphasis of an 11-year-old boy who has just detected something potentially interesting. "My best friend," said Harry simply, and picked up his astronomy reading, and Ron made a sound and went back to his game, and the dormitory settled into its evening rhythm of comfortable noise and lamplight, and somewhere in the south of France a 13-year-old girl with silver blonde hair was doing her own evening reading and would find Hedwig at her window sometime the following morning with a letter she would read twice, once quickly and once slowly, and then sit with for a little while before beginning her reply. Dumbledore found Harry on Friday, walking back from the greenhouses with soil on his hands and the particular settled look he got after an hour in contact with growing things. "A moment, Harry," said Dumbledore, falling into step beside him. "Of course," said Harry. They walked in companionable silence for a moment. They had learned this over 4 years of visits, that silence between them could be useful rather than awkward. Dumbledore had his hands clasped behind his back and was looking at the castle with the expression of someone who has known a place for a very long time and still finds it worth looking at. "You spoke to Severus," Dumbledore said. "In potions, yes. His published paper." "How did you know about it?" "The French archive," said Harry. "And Céleste mentioned him once in the context of dark arts countermeasures research. I looked him up." He looked at Dumbledore. "He's very good." "He is," said Dumbledore, and there was something in his voice when he said it. "He is also someone whose trust is not easily established, and who is in a position of some complexity with respect to what is coming." "I know he was a Death Eater," said Harry. "I know he's your spy. I know he has the dark mark." He paused. "I'm not interested in his past. I'm interested in whether he's going to be a useful person to know." Dumbledore looked at him. "He will be," said Harry. "You are," said Dumbledore, "remarkably unsentimental for someone of your age." "I'm not unsentimental," said Harry. "I care about a lot of people. I just don't confuse caring about people with ignoring what they've done or what they're capable of." He looked at the castle. "There's something going on in the third-floor corridor." Dumbledore stopped walking. "The right-hand side as you go in," said Harry. "I've been feeling it since the first night. It's something large and magical and it's being kept. The castle knows it's there and it's not entirely happy about it." He looked at Dumbledore. "Is that the stone?" "A beat." Yes," said Dumbledore. "Somewhat shorter path to that conclusion than I'd anticipated." "Does Voldemort know it's here?" "I believe someone in his service does," said Dumbledore carefully. "Then whoever it is, they're at Hogwarts," said Harry. "Or has been recently. The castle has a memory for presences, it holds impressions of intent. Something that shouldn't be here has been near that corridor in the last 3 weeks." Dumbledore was looking at him with the expression Harry had come to associate with the moment when the old man's model of what Harry could do encountered what Harry could actually do. It happened every visit, and every time the recalibration was slightly larger. "The castle told you this," said Dumbledore. "The castle doesn't tell me things," Harry said. It's more like reading the temperature of a room. Something has been pressing against the wards up there with the kind of attention that's not curious, it's hungry. And that impression doesn't go away quickly." He paused. "Whoever it is knows the stone is here and intends to get it. And they'll try before the year is out." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. They had stopped walking entirely, standing in the courtyard with the late afternoon light coming through the arched windows and the sound of students somewhere above carrying down through the stone. "What would you like to do about it?" Dumbledore said. Genuinely asking. "Nothing yet," said Harry. "Watch. I want to know who it is." He started walking again. "And I'd like to know why the stone is here rather than somewhere more secure, if you don't mind telling me." "That is a longer conversation," said Dumbledore. "Thursday at 7, said Harry. A pause. "Thursday at 7, said Dumbledore. Harry went to clean the soil off his hands, and the afternoon went on being golden and purposeful, and the castle went on holding its enormous ancient magic around all of it like a presence that had seen enough of the world to know which things were worth watching. In a dungeon office deep in the castle, Severus Snape sat at his desk reading his own manuscript, the original, rejected version, pulled from where he kept it because no one had ever read it and said what Harry Potter had said, and he was trying to determine what, exactly, he was supposed to do with that. The mark on his arm, dormant for years, felt as quiet as it ever did. He put the manuscript down. Picked up a quill. Began, for the first time in several years, a new line of research that the original argument had pointed toward but he'd never followed, because he'd thought it wasn't worth following if no one could see the original was right. And in a room in Paris, Aldrich Pruitt read a report from an informant at Hogwarts, a brief, factual account of Harry Potter's first week, and sat back in his chair with an expression that was not fear but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man who has spent years managing a variable and has just realized the variable has become something else entirely. He reached for his quill too. His letter, unlike Snape's new research, was not going to lead anywhere good. Chapter 5, The Shape of a War. 3 years at Hogwarts had done interesting things to Harry's reputation. Not the boy who lived reputation. That one had arrived fully formed and he'd found the simplest approach was to neither cultivate it nor fight it, just let it sit there like furniture in a room you'd stop noticing. The other reputation. The one that had accumulated through 3 years of being himself in a building full of people paying close attention, the way reputations do when you're not trying to build one, which is always when they're most accurate. What Hogwarts knew about Harry Potter by his 3rd year was this. He was the only student in living memory to have accelerated curriculum agreements with 4 different professors simultaneously. He had redesigned the Gryffindor Quidditch team's tactical formations in 2nd year, purely for interest, and the team had won the cup. He had once talked a fully grown devil's snare into voluntary cooperation in herbology, which Professor Sprout still mentioned in the context of discussing plant magical sensitivity as though she still wasn't entirely sure what she'd witnessed. Snape had given him an outstanding on every potions assessment since 1st year and had stopped trying to make the dungeon atmosphere intimidating and had started making it demanding instead, which the rest of the class found marginally preferable and Harry found genuinely engaging. The restricted section had his name on the internal Hogwarts library ledger as a pre-approved borrower, which was unprecedented and which Madame Pants had announced to him on his first request with the specific tone of someone conveying both a privilege and a test. He'd found the Philosopher's Stone situation in 1st year easier than Dumbledore had anticipated. Quirrell had lasted until December before making his attempt. Harry had been watching him since September, the way you watch a fire you know is going to spread, just tracking the pace of it. When Quirrell finally went for the stone on a Tuesday evening, Harry had already told Dumbledore it was coming, had already spoken to McGonagall and Snape, and the entire chamber sequence had been considerably less dramatic than it might have been because 3 adults with actual combat experience had been 2 corridors away when it happened. Harry had still gone in, not out of heroism but because Quirrell's presence in the chamber had disrupted the enchantment sequence in a way that required someone with specific druidic attunement to recalibrate. He'd done that, kept himself out of Quirrell's reach while doing it, and been back out in 20 minutes. Voldemort's wraith, departing Quirrell's disintegrating body, had paused in front of Harry for a long moment before leaving. Harry had looked at it steadily. "You," Voldemort had said, in a voice like wine through dead wood. "Me," Harry had agreed. And then the wraith had gone, and Harry had gone back to the corridor to find Dumbledore and McGonagall and Snape arriving at speed, and had reported what had happened with the factual economy of someone filing an operational debrief. Snape had looked at him for a long moment afterward. "You were not frightened," Snape said. It was not quite a question. "I was alert," said Harry. "That's more useful." 2nd year had been the Chamber of Secrets, which had been more complicated. A basilisk living in the school's plumbing was a different category of problem than a possessed professor, primarily because it was attacking students and Harry could feel every attack happening through the castle's presence before anyone else knew about it. He'd told Dumbledore about the chamber in October, 2 months before the attacks began. He'd felt the thing in the pipes from his first week, a large old presence, not hostile exactly but not calibrated for a school building. Dumbledore had begun investigating from that point, which meant that when the attack started he had a head start on the response. The actual chamber had been Harry's idea to enter and Ron's idea to bring the car, which was the kind of problem-solving that only worked once and which Ron was still slightly proud of. Hermione, who had been petrified in November and woken furious in February, had spent the remainder of the year doing things with the basilisk venom and the mechanics of its gaze that had produced 2 published papers in the Hogwarts Academic Journal and a standing invitation from the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. Ron Weasley had, over 3 years, become the kind of friend Harry hadn't known he was looking for. Not the same as Fleur. Fleur was architecture, the deep structural thing, the person who had been present for all the foundational work. Ron was something else, something that operated in the present tense rather than the historical, the person who made living at Hogwarts feel like living rather than a placement. His instincts were good, his loyalty was absolute, his chess was extraordinary, and his social intelligence was the kind that operated below his own conscious awareness, which made it more reliable rather than less. Harry trusted him the way you trust someone who has been honest with you when honesty was inconvenient. Hermione had become essential in a different way. She was the person who could hold more information than anyone else in a room, organize it faster, and find the structural flaw in an argument at a speed that was occasionally annoying and consistently invaluable. She had also, over 3 years, developed from someone who confused knowledge with wisdom into someone who was learning the difference, which Harry thought was one of the more important things a person could do. Neville had grown into his knowledge of herbology the way plants grow into good soil, slowly and then all at once. By 3rd year he was doing independent research projects with Sprout that were 3 years above his level, and he'd started walking differently, as if he'd finally noticed his own bones. It was October of 3rd year when the Dementor got on the train. Harry had felt it before the compartment door opened, a cold that wasn't weather, a specific draining quality that he recognized from Celeste's descriptions as the Azkaban presence. He'd told the others to brace themselves approximately 4 seconds before the door slid open and the thing flowed in, dark and vast and pulling at the warmth in the air. He stood up. He didn't reach for his wand first. He reached inward, to the druidic foundation, to the thing that was connected to living systems, to growth, to the specific warmth of things that were alive and intended to stay that way. He let it rise the way it had been trained to rise, not a spike but a steady build, and then he pushed it outward in a wave. The Dementor stopped. Pulled back. Left. The compartment temperature returned. Ron, who had gone pale, let out a breath. Hermione was gripping the armrest. Neville had knocked his trunk off the luggage rack and was sitting on the floor looking up at Harry with the expression he'd worn since 1st year when Harry did something that recalibrated his sense of scale. "What," said Ron, "was that?" "A Dementor," said Harry. He sat back down. "Azkaban guard. They're not supposed to board the train." He looked at the window. The train was moving again, the Dementor's presence receding as they pulled away from its location. Someone let them onto the Hogwarts Express, which is either a security failure or a choice. "How did you?" Hermione started. "Warmth," said Harry. Dementors feed on positive emotion because positive emotion is the byproduct of living things being well. You counter them with the same thing they feed on, but generated deliberately rather than passively. He paused. "A Patronus does it formally. What I did was less structured but sufficient for one Dementor on a train." "A fully corporeal Patronus equivalent," said Hermione slowly, "is supposed to be an EWT-level magic at minimum." "It's not a Patronus," Harry said again. "It's a different mechanism. Same result." "Still," said Hermione. "3rd year." Said Harry, and picked up his book again, which was his version of closing a subject he found more interesting to practice than discuss. The professor who'd been sitting in the corner throughout this entire episode had been asleep, or apparently asleep, when the Dementor arrived, and woke up after it left with an expression that suggested he had not been entirely asleep and had been watching. He had a worn face and tired eyes and the particular look of someone who had been through enough to know what a thing was when they saw it. "Remus Lupin," he said, not to the compartment in general but to Harry specifically. "I know your name," said Harry. "You were a friend of my father's." Lupin looked at him with those tired eyes. "Yes," he said. "I was." "Then we have things to talk about," said Harry. "But maybe not right now." "No," said Lupin. "Not right now." He looked at Harry for a moment longer with an expression that was grief and recognition in equal measure, then reached into his coat and produced a chocolate bar that he broke into pieces and distributed to the whole compartment without further comment. Harry took his piece and ate it and looked out the window at Scotland arriving through the rain and thought about fathers he hadn't known and friends of fathers who were carrying their losses still, and filed Remus Lupin under important, handle carefully. The news broke in November. Sirius Black had escaped from Azkaban. Harry knew about Sirius Black. He had known about Sirius Black for 2 years, since Moody's second visit to the Delacour house had included, among other things, a thorough account of the events of November 1981, Pettigrew, the secret keeper switch, the trail of evidence that had been assembled in 48 hours and used to put an innocent man in prison without a trial. Harry had sat with Moody's version of events for a long time, cross-referenced it with everything Dumbledore had shared about the Potters last months, and had arrived at a conclusion that the official record had not. Peter Pettigrew was alive. He'd felt it. Not literally, Pettigrew wasn't at Hogwarts, but in the way that certain truths presented themselves to him when he paid full attention to a problem without the limitations of what was officially known. The story of Sirius Black had a shape that didn't fit its ending. A man who had betrayed his best friends, killed 12 muggles with a single curse, and then laughed when the Aurors came for him was not a man who then spent 12 years in Azkaban without going insane. Azkaban broke people. It had broken every prisoner Moody had ever discussed. Sirius Black, according to the escape reports, had walked out looking thin and haunted but fundamentally intact. Which meant either he was something genuinely extraordinary, or he had something that had kept him from surrendering to despair. Innocence, Harry had decided, was a kind of anchor. You could survive almost anything if you knew the truth of yourself. He'd written to Celeste when the news broke. Her reply came the next morning. "He is innocent. I have suspected this since 1984. If he comes to you before the Ministry finds him, give him shelter and listen before you judge. The truth of that night is not what anyone was told. Moody knows more than he has shared, ask him directly when you next speak. Also, be careful. The Ministry is frightened of him and frightened men make bad decisions. I love you. Eat properly." Harry folded the letter, put it in his trunk, and went to find Lupin. Lupin's office was at the top of the North Tower, and it had the organized dishevelment of someone whose mind was always working on several things simultaneously, papers and books and a tea service that had been recently used and not cleared, several fascinating magical objects on the shelf that Harry catalogued with interest, and a boggart in the wardrobe that Harry could feel through the wood, shifting and uncertain. "You know about Sirius Black," said Harry, without preamble, dropping into the chair across from Lupin's desk. Lupin looked up from his marking. If he was surprised by the directness, it didn't show, though Harry had the impression that very little surprised Lupin by this point in his life, because he'd dealt with enough to have developed a broad expectation of what the world could produce. "Yes," said Lupin. "You know he's innocent," said Harry. A pause. Longer this time. Lupin set down his quill. "What makes you say that?" "The story doesn't fit," said Harry. Pettigrew was the secret keeper. Sirius switched with him at the last minute because he thought himself too obvious a choice. Pettigrew betrayed them, killed 12 muggles with the explosion, cut off his own finger in the chaos and transformed. He's been hiding ever since in his animagus form. He paused. "You know what form that is?" Lupin was very still. "He's been at Hogwarts," said Harry. "I haven't identified him yet specifically, but there's a rat in this castle that is not an ordinary rat. I've been feeling something wrong in the small animals since September. He looked at Lupin steadily. That's why Sirius broke out. He saw Pettigrew in the newspaper. He's coming here. Lupin's composure, the tired, careful composure of someone who had been managing very difficult things alone for a long time, cracked just slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough to see what was underneath, which was a man who had been carrying a terrible story alone for 12 years and was looking at the prospect of it being over. How long have you known this? He said. About Pettigrew specifically, 2 years, said Harry. I couldn't prove it. I still can't, yet. He paused. When Sirius comes, and he will come, I'm not going to run from him. I'm going to talk to him. I need you to know that, because I think your instinct when it happens will be to put yourself between us. He was your father's best friend, said Lupin. Before. But if there's any chance, there isn't, said Harry. He didn't do it. He met Lupin's eyes. I'd know. I feel the truth of people, Remus. Not perfectly, not like reading a book. But I know what guilt that size feels like, and Sirius Black's history doesn't feel like that. It feels like 12 years of injustice. He paused. So when he comes, let me talk to him first. Lupin looked at him for a very long time. Your father, he said quietly, used to do something very like this. He'd walk into a situation that frightened everyone else and just be very still in the middle of it. Like the stillness was its own kind of power. Tell me about him, said Harry. And Lupin told him. They sat in the North Tower office for an hour and a half, with the tea going cold and the rain against the windows and the boggart in the wardrobe, and Lupin talked about James Potter, not the legend, not the father from the stories, but the actual person, the James who laughed too loudly and played Quidditch with complete recklessness and was irritatingly good at everything he tried and was also, underneath all of it, one of the most genuinely loyal people Lupin had ever known. Harry listened. He didn't say much. He just held the picture of his father that was forming, real and complicated and funny, and added it to the one he'd been building since Celeste had first given him space to want it, and when he walked back to Gryffindor Tower that evening he was carrying something new in his chest alongside everything else, not grief exactly, which he'd processed already in the methodical way he processed difficult things, but something warmer and more forward-looking. Connection. To people he'd never met. To a history that was also a direction. Sirius arrived on a Thursday night in March. Not subtly. He transformed on the third-floor corridor, which Harry had been walking down from the library with Ron and Hermione, because the universe apparently had a preference for third-floor corridors where Harry was concerned. One moment there was a large black dog padding toward them from the shadows, the next, Sirius Black. He was thin. Dramatically thin, 12 years of Azkaban thin. His hair was long and tangled and his eyes, gray and sharp, moved around the space with the alert speed of someone whose survival instincts had been running at full capacity for a decade. He was, immediately and unmistakably, dangerous in the way that people are dangerous when they have nothing left to lose, except for one thing. He looked at Harry. And stopped. Prongs, he said. Very quietly. Not to Harry. To the air beside Harry, or to something he was seeing that was behind Harry's face. I'm Harry, said Harry. You're Sirius Black. I know you're innocent. Come with me. Ron made a sound. Hermione made a different sound, more compressed, the sound of someone keeping a significant reaction under very tight control. Sirius looked at Harry with those gray eyes, and what Harry felt from him was exactly what he'd expected and also, experienced directly, considerably more affecting, a 12-year grief compressed to diamond density, and underneath it, burning still, the clean clear flame of someone who knew the truth of himself. You know, said Sirius. Not believing, yet. Testing. Pettigrew, said Harry. He's in this castle. And you're here to find him. He paused. So am I. Let's do it together. Ron said, "I'm sorry, what?" Harry looked at his best friend. "You're rat, Ron." The silence that followed was the longest one Harry had sat in since the day he'd told Dumbledore about the Horcrux. Ron looked at Scabbers, who was in his pocket, who had been in his pocket or his brother's pockets or the family house for 12 years, who was looking at Sirius with the tiny bright eyes of a creature who had just realized its location was known. Scabbers bolted. He didn't get far. Harry had anticipated this. He'd been carrying a modification of a containment charm that Celeste had taught him and that he'd been refining for 2 months, and it went around Pettigrew's animagus form like a net before he'd made 3 feet, holding him in the transformed state, unable to shift back, unable to escape. Harry crouched down and looked at the rat. "Hello, Peter," he said. The rat trembled. "We're going to have a conversation," said Harry. "And then we're going to go find Remus, and you're going to tell him and Sirius what you told Voldemort, and we're going to clear Sirius's name before the Ministry shows up." He paused. "You don't have to like it. But this is what's happening." Sirius Black stood in the corridor and looked at Harry, and something happened in his face, the 12-year compression finding a crack, light coming through it, the specific look of someone who has been in the dark for so long they've forgotten what they were waiting for and have suddenly remembered. "James would have liked you," he said. His voice was rough. "Very much." "Lupin said the same thing," said Harry. He stood up. Looked at Sirius directly. "I know about my father. I've been building a picture of him for 4 years. I'd like you to help me finish it." Sirius looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Yeah," and there was an entire world in the single syllable. "Yeah, I'd like that too." They took Pettigrew to Lupin's office, where the reunion between Lupin and Sirius was quiet and fierce and not something Harry felt he needed to witness in full, so he stood in the corridor with Ron and Hermione and waited. Ron, who had been processing since the corridor, said, Scabbers was a person." "Yes," said Harry. "He was in my pocket." "Yes." "For 12 years." "Yes." That is a lot to sit with," said Ron. "I know," said Harry. "I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. I wasn't certain enough until this year." He looked at Ron. "Are you all right?" Ron was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ask me tomorrow." Which was honest, and Harry respected it, and they stood in the corridor in companionable difficult silence until the office door opened. The Ministry arrived in force 2 days later, because the Ministry's response time when things had already been resolved was remarkably prompt. Fudge, Pettigrew in custody, Dumbledore present, and a Wisengamot special session that was conducted with more speed than the body usually managed when the alternative was admitting 12 years of false imprisonment. Harry gave evidence at the session. He was 13. He gave it clearly, factually, in the precise organized way he'd developed over years of learning to present complex information, and he included the methodology by which he'd identified Pettigrew, which caused approximately 40% of the room to look at him in the way people looked at him when they were updating their model of what he was. Fudge asked, with a careful smile that didn't reach his eyes, how a 13-year-old student had identified a concealed animagus that had evaded Ministry detection for 12 years. "I paid attention," said Harry. "And I didn't start from the assumption that the official record was correct." Fudge's careful smile stayed exactly where it was. Harry noted this, filed it, and moved on to the next question. Sirius was cleared. The session took 4 hours. The verdict was unanimous, partly because the evidence was incontrovertible and partly because Dumbledore had spent the previous 2 days being very thorough in the preparation, and partly because Harry had sent a letter to Theodore Beaumont in Paris the morning after Pettigrew's capture, and Theodore had arrived at the Ministry that morning with a specific legal document pertaining to the Legacy Compact's requirement for due process in the detention of anyone connected to a compact holder. Which Harry was, and which Pettigrew technically was as a historical associate of the Potter line, and which provided sufficient procedural pressure that the Ministry's usual capacity for institutional inertia was significantly reduced. Fudge, walking past Harry after the verdict, stopped and looked at him with those careful eyes and that careful smile. "Remarkable young man," he said. "Thank you, Minister," said Harry pleasantly. Fudge moved on. Harry watched him go and thought, "There's the next problem," and filed it. Sirius, freed, came to stand beside him. He was already looking more like a person than he had in the corridor. A week of food and sleep and Lupin's company had done visible work. He still had the Azkaban quality in his eyes, the shadow of 12 years, but it was settling towards something manageable rather than defining. "He's going to be trouble," said Sirius, looking at Fudge's retreating back. "Yes," said Harry. "He's afraid of Voldemort's return and he's more afraid of admitting it. Men like that make themselves dangerous by making the inconvenient thing disappear rather than dealing with it." He paused. "He's already decided I'm inconvenient." "You're 13, said Sirius. "That's not going to be a deterrent," said Harry. Sirius laughed, the first genuine laugh Harry had heard from him, rough and startled, like a muscle rediscovering its function. "No," he said, "I suppose not." He looked at Harry sideways. "What do you want to do about it?" "Not yet," said Harry. "He's a problem for later. Right now I want to know where Pettigrew was between 1981 and now. Specifically who he was reporting to when Voldemort was too weak to be contactable." He looked at Sirius. "Because Pettigrew didn't spend 12 years as a rat out of simple survival instinct. He was waiting. Someone was managing him." Sirius was quiet. The laughter had faded but something remained of it, a quality of being present, engaged, the specific alertness of someone whose mind was back in operation after years of being submerged. "The Legacy Compact," he said slowly. Harry looked at him sharply. "Your father told me about it. The old families. He found documents in the Potter vault when he was 19 and spent 6 months furious about them. He was going to challenge the compact formally before," he stopped. "Before Voldemort," said Harry. "Yes. Then Pettigrew might have been placed with the Weasleys by someone in the compact rather than operating entirely independently," said Harry. "Hiding in plain sight and reporting on a blood-connected family while maintaining access to a compact holder's bloodline." He thought for a moment. "Pruitt. Aldrich Pruitt," said Sirius immediately. "He and your father had a specific conflict in 1979. Your father found evidence that Pruitt had been using the compact to redirect Potter family magical inheritance protocols. They were going to bring it to the Wizengamot the following spring." A pause. "And then Voldemort's people found your family's location." The courtyard was quiet around them. The afternoon had gone gold and long. "Pettigrew didn't just betray my parents to Voldemort," said Harry. "No," said Sirius. "I don't think he did. He betrayed them to the compact," said Harry. "Voldemort was the weapon. Pruitt was the one who aimed it." He felt something move through him then, not rage, which would have been understandable, but something colder and more useful, the kind of clarity that comes when a shape you've been tracing finally completes itself. That's what the 18 binding charms were actually about. Not managing a weapon. Removing an heir who was about to expose them. "Harry," said Sirius. He put a hand on Harry's shoulder, and Harry didn't move away from it, because it was offered honestly and it was James Potter's best friend and it meant something. "What are you going to do?" Harry looked at the Ministry building around them, the corridors of the Wizarding World's central power, the place that had imprisoned an innocent man for 12 years, that was home to the Wizengamot where Pruitt sat, that was run by a minister who was more afraid of truth than of Dark Lords. "I'm going to finish what my father started," said Harry. "The Compact Challenge. With the documentation I've been building for 4 years with Arbuthnot. And I'm going to do it before Voldemort comes back. Because when Voldemort comes back I want the board cleared of as much of this as possible." He paused. "And I'm going to need your help." Sirius looked at him for a long moment, and what was in his expression was something Harry had never seen directed at him from that angle, the specific look of someone who has needed to be useful for a very long time and has just been given something real to do. "All right," said Sirius. "Tell me what you need." The letter to Fleur that evening was the longest he'd written in 3 years. It covered everything: Sirius, Pettigrew, Pruitt, the shape of what he now understood about 1981, the compact challenge timeline, Fudge, the whole architecture of it laid out in his careful handwriting with the margins full of arrows where things connected. At the end he wrote, "Voldemort is going to return within the year. I feel it. The soul fragment in my scar has been waking up in small ways since September, more frequently in the last month. He's found a method. I think it involves Pettigrew, which is why someone needed Pettigrew free and operational and positioned with access to magical Britain. The compact may have been maintaining him as an asset toward exactly this end. I'm not afraid. I want you to know that. Not as a performance. I genuinely am not afraid of what's coming. I know what I am and I know what I can do and I know who is standing beside me. That's enough." Also Sirius laughed today and it was the best sound. "He's going to be impossible to live with, I can already tell. I'm going to love it. Write back soon. I want to know what you found in the Beaumont archive about the pre-compact druidic agreements." Harry Fleur's reply came 3 days later, by the fast overnight owl she used when something was important. It was 6 pages, dense, the margins full of annotations in her angular handwriting, and the Beaumont archive research was thorough and immediately useful and also, Harry noted, showed that she had been working on this specific angle for months without his having asked her to. The last paragraph read, "Don't tell me not to worry. I know you're not afraid and I know you can handle this. I'm not worried about whether you'll survive it. I'm worried about whether you'll let people help you properly when the time comes, because you have a tendency to decide something is your problem and carry it alone for 3 months before remembering that you're not actually required to do that. Come to France for Christmas. Grandmere has things to show you and I have things to say that are better said in person. Fleur P.S. I'm glad about Sirius. He came to France for Christmas. The Delacour house in December was different from in summer, the plane trees bare, the roses cut back, the garden going in on itself for winter with the quiet intent of things that know how to wait. But the inside of the house was fully, completely itself, warm and lit and full of the organized chaos of the Delacour Christmas, which involved Apollon cooking for approximately 15 people regardless of how many were actually present, and Gabrielle decorating everything within reach with the comprehensive enthusiasm of a 9-year-old who treated tinsel as a natural resource, and Jean-Pierre home from wherever he'd been this time, presiding over the whole thing with the warm amusement of a man who knew exactly how fortunate he was. Sirius had come. Harry had invited him and he'd come with the slightly stunned quality of someone who had not celebrated Christmas in a real house for 12 years, and Apollon had embraced him within 30 seconds of meeting him and told him he was too thin, which made him laugh and look slightly undone simultaneously. Celeste received him in her study, just the two of them, for an hour. Whatever was said in that room, Sirius came out looking like he'd been through something that was also a relief, the expression of a man who has been seen clearly and found the experience bracing rather than comfortable but essentially worthwhile. What did she say to you? Harry asked. That grief is not the same as guilt, said Sirius, and I need to stop treating them as one thing. He looked at the fire in the sitting room. She's terrifying. Yes, said Harry. She's also the reason I'm not in a cupboard in Surrey. Sirius looked at him. I know, said Harry. I know. Fleur found Harry in the garden on Christmas Eve, because the garden was always where he went when he was thinking. The night was cold and clear and the sky over southern France was the specific dark of winter countryside, very large, full of stars. She was wearing a coat over her nightdress and had brought 2 cups of something hot, which she handed him one of without comment. They stood at the rose wall and drank in silence for a while. The archive research, said Harry. The pre-compact agreements. What did you actually find? The original druidic framework, said Fleur. Before the 7 families codified it into the compact, there was an older system. More distributed. The power wasn't held by families, it was held by the land itself, channeled through practitioners who had specific attunements. She looked at him. Your attunement. The earth magic, the elemental connection, the circle de vérité. Those aren't Potter family traits. They're much older. The compact co-opted them and called them a Potter inheritance, but they predate the Potter family by centuries. Harry looked at the old rose. He could feel it even in winter, the dormant life in it, the deep-root knowledge, the slow and certain presence. The original system had a role, said Fleur. A specific practitioner whose function was to hold the balance. Not a weapon, not a sacrifice. A steward. Someone who maintained the connection between magical practice and the land itself, between what wizards did and what the world could sustain. A druid, said Harry. The old practitioner, said Fleur. The compact called the role dead. They said the last one died in the 15th century and the function was absorbed into the hereditary holdings. She turned to look at him fully. They were lying. The function can't be inherited. It can only be grown into. And it presents approximately once every 3 to 5 generations. A pause. The last confirmed instance was 1683. A woman in Cornwall who the compact tried to co-opt and failed because she was considerably more than they'd bargained for. Harry was quiet. The binding charms, said Fleur. All 45. The compact ones, Dumbledore's, the Ministry's. They weren't trying to make a weapon. They weren't even primarily trying to suppress power. Her voice was careful and precise, the way it always was when she was delivering something important. They were trying to prevent the old practitioner from waking up. Because an old practitioner cannot be controlled, and every significant power structure in magical Britain, the Ministry, the Wisingamot, the old families, is built on the assumption that the land's magic can be managed. Parceled. Owned. And it can't be, said Harry. And it can't be, said Fleur. It never could. They've just been successful at preventing anyone from demonstrating that. She looked at him steadily. Until now. The night was very quiet around them. The stars moved in their enormous indifferent arc. The rose wall breathed its winter patience. Harry stood in the cold garden of the Delacour house, 7 years after he'd arrived here as a child carrying a pillowcase with everything he owned, and felt the full shape of what he was for the first time, not as a weight, not as a destiny, but as a fact, a clean and simple one, like the fact of the stars or the deep knowledge of the old rose. Voldemort, he said. His return. The Horcrux in my scar. All of it. He paused. Ravensworth. Ravensworth, said Fleur. The head of the compact. The oldest family of the founding 7. He looked at her. They need Voldemort to return. Not to follow him. He's not the point. The point is what happens in the wake of a war, the restructuring, the power vacuum, the opportunity to redesign the wizarding world's foundations before the rubble's even cleared. He felt the shape of it settle. If the old practitioner is active during that restructuring, the land's magic will resist any framework that tries to own it. The compact families lose the source of their inherited power permanently. Yes, said Fleur. So they need Voldemort's war to happen before I'm ready, said Harry. Or they need to win the war and establish the new framework before I'm powerful enough to resist it. He looked at her. How long do we have? Arbuthnot's last letter, said Fleur. The soul fragment in your scar. It'll be sufficient for a basic resurrection ritual by the end of next year. Then I need to be ready before the end of next year, said Harry. You need to extract it, said Fleur. Before then. Remove the fragment, remove Voldemort's access to you, and complete the other Horcrux work. Then when he comes back diminished and without a connection into your system. She paused. And then you deal with Ravensworth. And then I deal with Ravensworth, said Harry. Fleur finished her drink. Set the cup down on the stone wall. Looked at him with those blue eyes, and he looked back, and they were 15 and 17 and they had grown up alongside something massive and had done it together, and whatever that was between them, it was so much itself by now that neither of them had ever needed to name it. You're going to be all right, she said. It was not comforting language. It was Fleur's language, which was accurate. I know, said Harry. I mean specifically, she said. Not just survive this. You're going to be all right. He understood the distinction. I know, he said again, and meant it differently the second time. They went inside. The house was warm and lit and full of Christmas, and Sirius was being taught a French card game by Gabrielle with extreme seriousness on both sides, and Apollon was singing something to herself in the kitchen, and Jean-Pierre had fallen asleep by the fire with a book on his chest, and Celeste was writing letters because Celeste was always writing letters, but she looked up when they came in and her expression was the one she kept for the moments that mattered. Harry sat down. The fire was warm on his face. Outside, the French countryside went on being cold and vast and alive in its winter way, and the stars continued their indifferent and beautiful turning, and somewhere in England something was waking up that was going to require everything he had. He was ready. Chapter 6, Everything That Was Bound. The resurrection happened on June 24th. Harry felt it at 11:47 in the evening, sitting at his desk in the Gryffindor dormitory with the window open to the warm June night and Arbuthnot's latest letter spread out in front of him. The soul fragment in his scar detonated like a flare, not painful, not anymore, because he'd spent 14 months learning to hold that piece of foreign soul at arm's length, studying its edges the way you study a lock before you pick it. But it fired. A surge of cold recognition through the connection, Voldemort's consciousness briefly enormous and triumphant and present in a way it hadn't been in 14 years. He was back. Harry sat very still for approximately 4 seconds. Then he reached for his quill, wrote 3 words on a piece of parchment, "It's tonight, now," gave it to Hedwig, and started getting dressed. The plan had been in place for 7 months. Everyone had their piece of it, Dumbledore, Sirius, Lupin, Arbuthnot at Gringotts, Moody running the operational security. Theodore Beaumont in Paris with the compact challenge documents, formally lodged with the International Confederation of Wizards 3 weeks ago. And Fleur, who had finished her 7th year at Beauxbatons in May and was, as of 2 weeks ago, resident at the Delacour house with Celeste, waiting. Harry was not going to the graveyard. That had been the first decision, made last December in the garden, confirmed in February when Dumbledore had identified the ritual site in Little Hangleton. If Voldemort needed Harry's blood for the resurrection ritual, the ritual wasn't going to use it. Simple. The graveyard would proceed without him, using a modified decoy arrangement that Moody had worked out with characteristic thoroughness, and the resurrection would happen regardless. Wormtail would find another way, there was always another way, but it would happen without Harry's blood, which meant Voldemort would return diminished and the protection Lily Potter had built into Harry's blood would remain intact rather than being fed to his enemy. What Harry needed to do tonight was the other thing. The thing that had to happen before Voldemort reconstituted enough to act. He left the dormitory. Ron was awake. Ron had been awake every night for the past week with the specific vigilance of someone who knew something was building and had refused, categorically and with the flat certainty that was one of his finest qualities, to be left out of whatever happened. "Tonight," said Ron, sitting up. "Tonight," said Harry. Ron was out of bed in 15 seconds flat, dressed in 30, wand in hand in 35. No discussion. No questions about whether this was really necessary or whether they should wait or whether someone should be notified first. Just, tonight, and Ron Weasley was standing beside him, ready. This was the thing about Ron that Harry had been trying to find a word for since first year. It wasn't bravery exactly, though it was that too. It was fidelity, the kind that doesn't require understanding every detail before it commits. Harry had experienced the alternative growing up. He knew the difference. Hermione was in the common room, because Hermione had been sleeping in the common room for a week with a wakefulness charm on the portrait hole. She looked up from her book when they came down, took in their expressions, closed the book, and stood up. "The graveyard?" she said. "Moody has the graveyard," said Harry. "We're going to the chamber." Hermione blinked. "The Chamber of Secrets." "The basilisk venom you extracted second year," said Harry. "You still have it." She looked at him with the expression she wore when she'd arrived at a conclusion faster than the conversation had gotten there and was deciding whether to say so. "The Horcruxes," she said. "There are 4 left after the diary in first year," said Harry. "A cup, a locket, a diadem, a snake. Arbuthnot's been tracking their locations for 2 years. Tonight we start." He paused. "But first the chamber." "The soul fragment," said Hermione. "Arbuthnot will be here in 20 minutes, said Harry. "I need the extraction done before Voldemort's new body is fully stable. There's a window, Celeste identified it 6 months ago. When the resurrection is complete and the soul in the new body is still integrating, the connection to the fragment in my scar goes briefly dormant. 3 hours, maybe 4. That's when Arbuthnot can extract without the main soul pulling the fragment back." Ron said, "Arbuthnot is coming to Hogwarts tonight. I asked McGonagall's permission in March," said Harry. "She said, and I quote, she had decided to stop being surprised by things I arranged in advance." They were moving as he said it, out of the portrait hole and down through the sleeping castle. Harry's hands were completely steady. He noticed this and thought it was a reasonable reflection of how he actually felt, which was the specific clear-headed state of someone who has been preparing for a long thing for a long time and has arrived at its beginning. Hogwarts was warm around him, the magic of the castle present and steady in its vast old way. He felt it respond to his movement through it, not altering or guiding, just aware. The specific awareness of something that had been watching him for 3 years and had made its assessment. The corridor on the 2nd floor. The girls' bathroom. The sink that Harry had opened once before in 2nd year with very different energy. He crouched beside it and didn't speak Parseltongue, because Parseltongue was Voldemort's influence on him and he'd done the work over 3 years of learning his own druidic language for things that Voldemort's gift had been mimicking. He pressed his hand to the basin and spoke to the stone itself, to the deep mechanism of the chamber, in the language that was his rather than inherited. The sink opened. The passage went down. Arbuthnot arrived via Fleur into McGonagall's office at midnight. He was a goblin of approximately 400 years, small and sharp and in possession of a leather satchel that clinked with contained magical implements, and he had been to the chamber once before for a preliminary survey and moved through it with the professional ease of someone who respects a space's danger without being inconvenienced by it. He looked at Harry. "The resurrection?" 11:47, said Harry. "Roughly 12 minutes ago." "Then we have the window," said Arbuthnot. He set his satchel down on the chamber floor and began laying out implements with the precise economy of someone who has rehearsed this extensively. "Sit. Don't talk unless I ask you something. Don't let your magic interfere with the working. I know that's difficult for you, specifically, so I'm telling you explicitly." "Understood," said Harry, and sat. Ron and Hermione stood against the far wall. Hermione had a notebook. Ron had his wand out, watching the tunnel entrance with the attentiveness of someone who has identified himself as the perimeter and takes the role seriously. Arbuthnot worked in silence. The extraction ritual was like nothing Harry had experienced before. It was goblin curse-breaking and druidic soul theory and something older than both, a framework Arbuthnot had assembled from the Department of Mysteries records that Dumbledore had obtained, from the Beaumont archive notes that Fleur had transcribed and sent, from Arbuthnot's own 4 centuries of understanding what bound things looked like from the inside. The implements drew light from the air itself, the specific cold-warm luminescence of soul-adjacent magic, and Harry sat in the center of it and held himself absolutely still and let it work. He felt the fragment. He'd always felt it, since the bindings came off, a cold weight at the back of his scar, a piece of something that wasn't him but had been there so long the boundary had gotten blurry. He could feel its edges now as Arbuthnot's working defined them, the ritual drawing clean lines around what was Harry and what was Voldemort with the precise discrimination of something that understood the difference even when proximity had muddied it. It hurt. Not catastrophically. Not unbearably. But the truth was that having a piece of someone else's soul pulled out of you was not a sensation that had a comfortable version, and Harry had known this going in and had decided it was still better than the alternative, so he sat with the pain and breathed through it and kept his magic from reacting, which was the hardest part, because his instinct was to shield and his magic's instinct was to help, and neither of those things were what was needed, and the discipline of not was always harder than the discipline of do. Hermione, across the chamber, was very still. Ron had not moved his eyes from the tunnel entrance. Arbuthnot said, without stopping his work, "It's resisting." "I know," said Harry. The fragment was aware, not conscious exactly, but it had Voldemort's fundamental nature, which included a significant survival instinct and a refusal to be diminished. "Can you hold the boundary?" "Yes. I need you to give it something to follow." "Meaning?" "The fragment will follow its origin," said Arbuthnot. "It is part of Voldemort's soul. It wants to return to him. If you create a channel, temporary, directional, it will move toward it rather than holding its position." Harry understood immediately. "You want me to open the scar connection?" "Briefly. Controlled." He'd spent 14 months learning to close it. Opening it deliberately, in a controlled way, while a goblin was performing extraction surgery on his soul, was not an experience he had specifically rehearsed. But the principle was sound: create the path, let the fragment follow its nature, let Arbuthnot capture it at the threshold. He reached for the connection and opened it. Voldemort flooded in. Not fully, the channel was narrow and Harry held it narrow, the way you open a window just enough to feel the weather without letting the rain in. But enough. The triumphant cold of a newly reconstituted consciousness, the specific dark pleasure of a man who had been formless for 13 years and was suddenly, catastrophically solid again. The rage. The hunger. The specific fixation that Harry recognized as the corner of Voldemort's mind that had been thinking about him, about the prophecy, about the thing that stood between him and everything he wanted. Harry let it wash over him and did not react. Did not fear. Did not respond. He held the channel and let the fragment feel the pull of its origin and watched it, in the space of his own consciousness, begin to move. "You," said Voldemort, through the connection, exactly as he had said it 7 years ago over Quirrell's dissolving body. Harry didn't answer. He just held the channel steady and let Arbuthnot do his work. Then Arbuthnot's working snapped shut like a trap, and the fragment was out, and the channel closed, and the connection went from a window to a wall to nothing in the space of 3 breaths, and Harry sat in the Chamber of Secrets with his hands on his knees and his forehead completely clear for the first time in his life. He breathed. The absence was extraordinary. Not painful. Not empty. Clean. The specific cleanness of a space from which something that was never supposed to be there has been permanently removed, and what's left is entirely, solely, irreducibly yours. Arbuthnot had the fragment in a containment vessel, a small sphere of something that was neither glass nor crystal but held it safely, the dark compressed energy of Voldemort's displaced soul visible as a dim moving shadow inside it. "Done," said Arbuthnot, and sounded, for a goblin, almost satisfied. Harry looked at the vessel. He felt no fear of it. No anger. The fragment had been part of him for 14 years and he bore it no particular ill will, it was simply a piece of something else that had been in the wrong place, and now it wasn't. "What do you do with it?" Ron said from the wall. "Gringotts' vault," said Arbuthnot. "Under maximum containment. When the other Horcruxes are destroyed, this one follows." He packed the vessel with the careful speed of someone with considerable experience handling dangerous objects. The connection is gone. He will feel the loss. He will not know what it means immediately, but he will feel it. Good, said Harry. He stood up. His legs were completely steady, which he was grateful for since he'd have found it irritating to be dramatically unsteady after all of that. He looked at Ron and Hermione. Next, he said. Hermione held up her case. Inside it, packed with the thorough preparation that was her signature contribution to everything they did together, were 3 vials of basilisk venom extracted from the second-year encounter and preserved by a stasis charm, a sword that was not the sword of Gryffindor but a copy made by a Gringotts metalsmith using the same goblin silver process, and a map marked with 3 location points. The locket, said Hermione, is in a cave on the Devon coast. The cup is in the Lestrange vault at Gringotts. Arbuthnot has already prepared access. The diadem is in the room of requirement. She paused. Nagini we deal with when we deal with Voldemort. The cave tonight, said Harry. The vault tomorrow. The diadem we can do now, it's here. Tonight, said Ron. The window, said Harry. While he's still integrating. His connection to the Horcruxes is weakest right now, he can't feel them being destroyed the way he normally could. Dumbledore identified that in the theoretical work. He looked at Arbuthnot. You said 3 hours. 2.5, now, said Arbuthnot. Then we move. The room of requirement produced itself for Harry with the immediate cooperation that the castle had been extending him for 3 years, not the junk room version, but a specific room, stone-walled and ancient, where the diadem of Ravenclaw sat on a stone pedestal surrounded by the specific layered magic of a Horcrux. It smelled of old ambition and long decay. Harry looked at it. The diadem was beautiful in the way of dangerous things, intricate silver, set with a blue stone, carrying the imprint of Rowena Ravenclaw's intelligence like a ghost's perfume, and underneath that the darker work of what had been done to it. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. He reached into the Druidic Foundation, the deep warm living system connection, and brought up the specific working he had developed for this over the previous months. Not a destruction spell. Not a force. The basilisk venom was for the objects you had to strike. This was different. The diadem had been created by intelligence and could be unmade by clarity, the kind of clarity that was specifically what Harry was. He let the circle de verite come, not the formal working but its essential nature, truth, clean and complete, brought to bear on something that had been built from fundamental dishonesty about what a soul was and whether it could be made permanent. The diadem cracked along its entire surface simultaneously, the way ice cracks on a warming lake, every line finding every other line, and then it came apart. Not violently. Not explosively. It simply finished. Ceased to be a Horcrux and became, in the space of a breath, just broken silver on a stone floor. Hermione wrote something in her notebook. Ron let out a breath. Arbuthnot, who had seen the working and whose expression was not given to theatrics, made a sound that was his version of impressed. The cave, said Harry. The cave on the Devon coast was cold and black and the sea smelled of itself, vast and indifferent, and the basin in the center of the cave held the locket in its dark potion the way it had always held it, waiting for someone who understood the cost of taking it. Harry stood at the basin's edge. He'd read Dumbledore's notes on this place. He understood what the potion did, what it made you see, what it made you feel, the specific torture of it, designed to leave whoever drank it too broken to complete their purpose. He put his hand in the basin. The potion recoiled. Not from force. From what it felt, the specific magical nature of who was touching it, the deep-rooted warmth of the old practitioner, the living system attunement, the thing that was the direct opposite of what this potion had been designed to break. The potion had been made to destroy hope. It had encountered something that was, at its foundations, a form of living knowledge of what the world was and what it was capable of sustaining. It couldn't hold. The basin went dark. The locket rose. Harry took it, and Hermione gave him the venom-coated blade, and the locket opened its horrible eyes and showed him what Horcruxes showed people who tried to destroy them, the things you feared, the things you doubted, the personal wounds dragged up for inspection. It showed him the cupboard. The small dark space, the cot, the dust. 7 years of that. It tried to tell him that this was what he was, the thing in the cupboard, the unwanted thing, that everything since was borrowed and would be taken back. Harry looked at it. No, he said, conversationally. He drove the blade in. The locket screamed. Lockets don't scream, technically, but this one did, a sound like something that has been holding very tightly to existence being told its grip is gone. And then it was still. They were back in the castle by 3 in the morning. Arbuthnot left via the Hogwarts Fleur with the extracted soul fragment and the destroyed locket's remains and a list of 3 more items and the vault access he'd been preparing for 6 months. Ron was running on the specific adrenaline of someone who has been doing significant things and can feel the significance of them. Hermione had 3 pages of notes. Harry sat on the steps outside the main doors and felt the night. It was warm. The June darkness was soft and enormous and the stars were fully out, and the lake was a mirror for them, and the castle at his back was awake in its deep way, feeling everything on its grounds with that slow vast attention. He felt Voldemort. Not through the connection, that was gone. Through the air, through the land, through the specific disturbance that a soul as large and wrong as Voldemort's made in the magical fabric of things. He was in the graveyard still, or nearby. His Death Eaters had gathered. He was whole and furious and newly certain of his own inevitability. He was also, Harry knew, smaller than he'd been in the graveyard 14 years ago. The resurrection without Harry's blood had worked, Wormtail had used the bone and the flesh, had found another's blood for the ritual, but the protection Lily Potter had built was still in Harry's veins, untouched, and without the anchor of the 7th Horcrux, Voldemort's soul sat in its new body with the specific instability of something that was missing a piece of itself and didn't know what was missing. Not weak. Harry was not going to make the mistake of thinking diminished meant weak. But diminished. Good. Dumbledore arrived at dawn. He came across the grounds from the gate with the long, purposeful walk of a man who had been somewhere significant and was returning with things to report, and he found Harry on the steps and sat beside him with the ease of someone who had, over 4 years, learned where Harry was likely to be found when things were happening. "The graveyard," said Dumbledore. "Yes," said Harry. "He's back." "Yes." "And," said Dumbledore. "Soul fragment extracted," said Harry. "The diadem is gone. The locket is gone. Arbuthnot has the fragment and will complete the vault job today. The diadem destroyed at approximately 1:15 this morning." He looked at Dumbledore. 3 left. Nagini, the cup, and whatever the 6th one is that we haven't confirmed. You have a theory. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then, the snake was made last night. During the resurrection. The ritual's magic was significant enough. Then she's new, said Harry. Unstable. Which makes her the most dangerous in the short term because she's closest to him and he values her. He paused. The cup? Arbuthnot has it within 6 hours, said Dumbledore. And the 6th? I believe, said Dumbledore carefully, it is the ring. Marvolo Gaunt's ring, which is also the resurrection stone. It is in the Gaunt house in Little Hangleton, and it has a very powerful curse on it. He paused. I was going to investigate it myself, this summer. Don't, said Harry. Give me the location. I'll go with Arbuthnot. Dumbledore looked at him. The curse on the ring, said Harry. Temptation curse, isn't it? The stone calls the dead. You would be particularly vulnerable to that. Dumbledore stopped. Your sister, said Harry, gently. Ariana. The stone would show her to you, and you would be tempted to put it on, and the curse would take you. He held the old man's eyes. I'm telling you this not to wound you. I'm telling you because it's true and because you matter to what's coming, and I am not going to let someone I respect walk into a known trap when I can prevent it. Dumbledore was very still. The dawn was coming up gold over the lake behind them. You know about Ariana, he said quietly. Moody told me some, said Harry. And Celeste filled in the rest, last Christmas. She knew your family, when you were young. He paused. The guilt you've carried for 70 years has shaped every choice you've made, including the choices about me. I know that. I'm not bringing it up to use it against you. I'm bringing it up because the ring is going to use it against you, and I'd rather we dealt with it honestly first. Dumbledore put his hand over his eyes. It was the most human gesture Harry had ever seen from him. I have made many mistakes, he said. Yes, said Harry. And you've done many things worth doing. Both are true. He looked at the lake. Give me the location. Let Arbuthnot and me handle the ring. The ring is also the resurrection stone, said Dumbledore. The Deathly Hallows. If you're going where I think this is going, I know about the Hallows, said Harry. Of course he did. The cloak is already mine, said Harry. It came with the Potter Vault documentation 2 years ago. The wand, he paused, I don't want the Elder Wand. I have my own wand and I have the wandless work, and I'm not going to carry something that has been the object of 6 centuries of consecutive murder. That's not power, it's a curse with good marketing. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. And the stone, I don't need to speak to the dead to know what they would want for me. I know what my parents would want. I know what James Potter would say if he could say anything. I don't need the stone for that. Dumbledore looked at him with something that was vast and old and mostly grief-shaped but had light in it. What would they say? He asked, very quietly. They'd say live, said Harry simply. They didn't die so I could make a monument of their sacrifice. They died so I'd have a chance. I intend to use it. The dawn came up fully over the lake. The castle behind them woke into the sounds of itself, students and echoes, and the particular morning business of a very old magical building. The stars went out one by one in the brightening sky. Dumbledore gave Harry the location of the Gaunt house. The ring came off much more easily than expected, which Arbuthnot said was because the stone itself wanted to be free of the Horcrux. This was not standard goblin analysis. It was the kind of statement Arbuthnot made occasionally that suggested he had, in 4 centuries, developed an understanding of objects that went beyond professional and into something more like relationship. Harry held the ring for a moment, a plain black stone in an old gold setting, unremarkable, carrying the resurrection stone's weight only if you were sensitive enough to feel it, and felt the stone reach outward with its question, the question it always asked, "Is there someone you miss?" "Yes," said Harry, answering it honestly. "Several." The stone pulsed once, warm. He gave it to Arbuthnot with the curse removed and the Horcrux component destroyed, and Arbuthnot packed it away, and that was 4 down. The next weeks were the shape of a war that hadn't quite broken the surface yet. Voldemort was moving, carefully, quietly, rebuilding his network with the patience of someone who had learned the cost of announcing himself. Dumbledore formed the Order of the Phoenix in July with considerably more membership than the first one because Harry had spent 3 years building relationships and had, specifically, spent the last 6 months having a series of apparently casual conversations with people across the wizarding world that had left them, variously, better informed about what was coming and more prepared to do something about it. Sirius was central to this, operating with the energy of a man making up for 12 lost years at approximately double speed. He had reconnected with enough of the old Order's network to map who was still in place and who had died or defected, and he had an instinct for the specific social dynamics of the old wizarding families, who could be turned, who was already sympathetic, who was committed to Voldemort and couldn't be reached, that was invaluable in a way that straightforward intelligence work couldn't replace. Lupin ran the communication network. Hermione organized the information architecture, which was an extraordinary piece of work, a self-updating intelligence system that cross-referenced Death Eater movements, Ministry communications, Wisengamot votes, and old family financial records, all held in a modified undetectable extension charm that lived in a battered briefcase in her Hogwarts dormitory and responded only to her and Harry and could destroy itself in 3 seconds if necessary. Ron handled the human element in a way that no formal organizational chart could quite capture. He was the person everyone called first when they were frightened or uncertain or needed to be talked into something difficult, and he did it with the specific warmth of someone who had never needed status to make people feel heard. Fudge was the problem no one had resolved. The minister had spent the summer performing an increasingly elaborate public denial of Voldemort's return, which was partly genuine fear and partly, Harry had come to understand, legacy compact pressure. Fudge had compact entanglements that went back 15 years and made him vulnerable to certain pressures that Pruitt and company had been applying since July. He was not a bad man. He was a frightened one in a position of power, which was considerably more dangerous. The compact challenge documents that Theodore had lodged with the International Confederation came to formal proceeding in August. Harry appeared before the tribunal via International Fleur, 15 years old, in the formal wizarding robes that Apollon had insisted he own, and presented the case against Aldrich Pruitt with the same precise organized economy he'd brought to the Wisengamot for Sirius. 4 hours of testimony, Arbuthnot's Cursebreaker reports as technical evidence, Moody's Aura records as investigative evidence, and the Gringotts' authentication of the original compact documents as legal foundation. Pruitt's representative argued conflict of interest. The tribunal's presiding member, a Hungarian witch of considerable experience and zero patience for procedural stalling, dismissed it in 12 words and moved on. Pruitt lost his compact standing. His Wisengamot seat, which derived from that standing, was immediately challenged under British constitutional magical law. Theodore had prepared for this too, and the subsequent Wisengamot vote on the seat was 6 weeks ahead of where it would have been without the preparation, and Pruitt was gone from the chamber by September. Isolde not attended all of this with her careful society smile intact, and then, the following week, requested a private meeting with Harry. He met her in a neutral location, a conference room in the ministry, Sirius in the corridor, Moody on the floor. Isolde Knott was a woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone who had been powerful for a long time and intended to remain so, and the specific intelligence of someone who reassesses when the evidence requires it. She looked at him across the table. "You've won the Pruitt engagement," she said. "Not conceding, not surrendering. Assessing." "Yes," said Harry. "Ravensworth is going to be more complicated." "I know. He's not afraid of you," she said. "I want you to understand that. The other families feared what you represented because they'd built their power on preventing it. Ravensworth built his power on something different. He believes he's protecting something." "What?" said Harry. "He'd call it the integrity of the magical tradition," she said carefully. "The continuity of the old practices. The preservation of," she paused, "of what magic was before the ministry regulated it into something manageable and safe and diminished." She held his eyes. "He is not wrong about the diminishment. He is wrong about what the solution is. He thinks controlling the old practitioner is the solution," said Harry. "He thinks working with you is," she said. "That's the offer he's going to make. Not ownership. Partnership." "With conditions," said Harry. "With conditions." He looked at her steadily. "And you? What are you here for, if not to deliver his offer?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then, to tell you that the offer has conditions you won't accept, and that Ravensworth will not understand why you won't accept them, because he has genuinely convinced himself they're reasonable." She paused. "I was one of the 18, Harry. I put 2 of those binding charms on you when you were 11 months old. I did it because I believed it was necessary to manage the transition, to prevent what I thought would be a catastrophic and uncontrolled emergence of something the wizarding world wasn't ready for." A pause. "I was wrong. Not about the emergence being significant. About whether you needed to be managed." Harry looked at her for a long time. "Thank you for telling me that directly," he said. "I expect no absolution from it," she said. "Good," he said. "Because that's not mine to give. The damage was done to a child who didn't get a vote." He paused. But I'm interested in whether you're useful going forward, and I think you are, and I think you know things about Ravensworth's specific position that we need. So, tell me about the conditions. She told him. He was right that he wouldn't accept them. Ravensworth's offer, relayed through Isolde, was essentially, Harry would operate as the old practitioner in an arrangement where the compact families provided institutional support, resources, and political cover, in exchange for which Harry's use of his specific capacities would be, she used the word coordinated, which Harry recognized immediately as a synonym for directed. No, said Harry, when she finished. I expected that, she said. What does he do when I say no? He escalates, she said. He has resources I cannot detail in full. His family's magical inheritance is very old and very specifically oriented toward the kind of working that undoes what you are. She looked at him. Not bindings. Something older. The old families weren't only about control. They were about the specific kind of power that says, this thing should not exist outside our framework, and if it does, we unmake it. Unmaking magic, said Harry. Yes. He'd try to unmake me, said Harry, not as a frightened statement, as a clarifying one. He would try, she said. And he would not succeed. But the attempt would be damaging, and it would happen in public, and the public nature of it would be the point, to establish, for anyone watching, that the old practitioner is not a free agent but a function that the old families control. She paused. He wants to win the narrative even if he can't win the encounter. Then we need to control the narrative first, said Harry. And the place to do that is, the Wizengamot, she said. Yes. She reached into her bag and placed a folder on the table. I have been compiling this for 2 months, she said. Everything that constitutes the Ravensworth family's current compact standing, the evidence of their involvement in the binding charms, their financial connections to Voldemort's previous network, and the specific mechanism of their unmaking magic, which is in violation of 3 separate International Confederation statutes that have been on the books since 1903. She pushed it across the table. I am giving this to you. Harry looked at the folder. Then at her. This ends your connection to the compact, he said. Yes, she said. And it exposes your own involvement in the binding charms. Yes. Why? He said. She looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had made a decision she was going to live with. Because I have a granddaughter, she said. She's 4 years old. She has the specific magical signature of someone who is going to be extraordinary at something the current wizarding framework has no room for. And I watched your grandmother, she paused, caught herself, I watched Céleste Beaumont walk into a house in Surrey and set 45 binding charms on fire, and I thought, I put 2 of those there. And I'd like to be someone different. A pause. For her. And because it's right. Harry picked up the folder. Thank you, he said. Meaning it. She left. He sat with the folder for a moment, and then he sent a message to Theodore. Ravensworth moved in October. He moved publicly, which was what Isolde had predicted, a formal presentation before the Wizengamot challenging the legitimacy of the Legacy Compact Challenge proceedings on the grounds that the complainant, Harry Potter, was himself operating outside the boundaries of sanctioned magical practice. He had prepared it carefully, with the specific political understanding of a family that had been operating at this level for 8 centuries. It was, Harry thought, reading the advance notice Theodore sent, genuinely well constructed. In a world where Harry was what the bindings had been designed to make him, limited, uncertain, operating inside the framework rather than outside it, it would have worked. The man who stood up in the Wizengamot chamber on the 3rd of October was 15 years old, wearing the plain robes he'd worn for every formal proceeding he'd attended, with his hands in his pockets and the unruffled quality of someone who has been prepared for longer than anyone else has been planning. He was also not alone. Sirius sat in the Potter's seat, restored and formally held now for 8 months. Dumbledore was present as Chief Warlock. In the public gallery, Lupin, Hermione, Ron. And in the International Observer section, because she had come from France specifically and because wild magic could not be kept away from a thing that mattered. Fleur Delacour, 17 years old, in the pale blue of Beau's batons, with her arms folded and her chin up and her expression conveying, without any particular effort, that she found the whole proceeding somewhat beneath the level of what she knew was actually happening but was prepared to witness it regardless. Harry had not known she was coming. He caught her eye across the chamber. Her expression didn't change significantly, that was not Fleur's way. But something in it shifted, the private shift, the one for him, and he felt something warm and grounding go through him that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the specific human truth of being known. He turned back to the chamber. Ravensworth presented his case. He was a tall man, old in the way of the very old families, ancient without being Celeste's kind of ancient, which was earned, this was inherited and sitting on him less naturally. He was intelligent and his argument was structured and his voice carried the assumption of being heard, the assumption of the room rearranging itself around him. He spoke about the sanctity of the compact, about the responsibilities that came with certain inheritances, about the danger of certain magical capacities operating without institutional oversight. He looked, Harry noticed, almost entirely at Dumbledore while he spoke. Not at Harry. As if Harry were still a variable rather than a person. When he finished, the presiding warlock, "It was Dumbledore today," said, "Mr. Potter. You have the right of response." Harry stood up. "The Ravensworth family," he said, "has held compact standing for 8 centuries. In that time, by their own records, which I have here, authenticated by Gringotts, they have used that standing to restrict the magical development of 14 individuals across 7 generations, each of whom showed the specific characteristics of the old practitioner function. Of those 14, 6 died young in circumstances the compact records describe as managed transitions. 5 were bound so extensively that their magic never developed beyond basic functional level. 2 are living, in France and Norway respectively, and have been contacted by my legal representative and have submitted testimony to this chamber." The room was very quiet. "The 2 surviving," said Harry, "are both over 60 years old. They have both spent their lives believing they were magically ordinary, which is what the binding charms their families placed on them in infancy were designed to make them believe. Arbuthnot of Gringotts has confirmed in his report, which you have all received, that both bear the remnants of binding charm networks consistent with the specific Ravensworth family methodology." He paused. "Not oversight. Not management. Systematic suppression of a magical function that the Ravensworth family has been preventing from operating freely for 200 years, because the old practitioner's function, connection to the land's inherent magic, operating outside any institutional framework, is incompatible with the kind of power that is inherited rather than genuine." Ravensworth was on his feet. "This is not the appropriate forum, the Wisengamot," said Harry pleasantly, "is exactly the appropriate forum for a challenge to the compact standing of a compact holder who has acted against the compact's own founding terms, which include, in Article 7 of the original agreement, the explicit prohibition of using compact authority to suppress or redirect the magical inheritance of another holder or their descendants." He looked at Ravensworth directly for the first time, and held his eyes. "You have my copies of Articles 1 through 9 if you'd like to review them. They've been authenticated by the same Gringotts source that authenticated your own family standing, which means your objection to the methodology isn't available." "You are 15 years old," said Ravensworth, and it came out more exposed than he'd intended, the frustration under the composure, the specific frustration of someone who has organized their world around a premise and is watching the premise be methodically removed. "Yes," said Harry. "I am. And I've been doing this work since I was 9, so please believe I've been thorough." He sat back down. The vote on Ravensworth's compact standing was called 40 minutes later, after 3 separate procedural challenges that Theodore dispatched with the focused speed of someone who had been a wizarding barrister for 30 years and had never been given a case this well prepared. The result was 43-9. Ravensworth's compact standing was forfeit. His family's Wisengamot seat, held for 280 years, was vacated. Ravensworth stood and looked at Harry from across the chamber with the expression of someone who has just lost something they believed permanent. It was not a friendly expression. It was also not, Harry noticed, the expression of someone about to do something rash. It was the expression of someone rearranging, recalculating, filing the loss and looking for the next play. Harry met his eyes steadily and said nothing. The session closed. In the corridor outside, Sirius clapped him on the shoulder with the force of someone who feels emotions physically and has never entirely learned to moderate it. 800 years, he said, somewhat incoherently. 806, said Harry. How are you this calm? I'm not calm, said Harry. I'm focused. They're different. Hermione appeared with her notebook, began to say something about procedural implications for the remaining compact holders, and then stopped, because Fleur had come through the chamber doors and was crossing the corridor toward them, and something about the quality of her approach, direct, unhurried, as if the corridor were simply an inconvenience between where she'd been and where she was going, made Hermione's procedural analysis pause mid-thought. Fleur stopped in front of Harry. You didn't tell me you were coming, he said. I didn't need to tell you, she said. You knew I'd be here. He had known. Not because she'd written it, but because it was the kind of moment she would not miss, because she was Fleur and she showed up for things that mattered, and she had been showing up for him specifically since he was 7 years old and she was 9 and she'd brought him to the kitchen and shown him where the bread was. Thank you, he said. She looked at him for a moment with one of the private expressions, and then did something she had almost never done in front of other people, which was to put her arms around him. Brief, genuine, the specific warmth of someone who has been present for all of it and knows what today actually cost and is acknowledging it directly. He held on for a moment before she stepped back, and Ron, to his credit, was looking at the ceiling with great interest, and Hermione was writing in her notebook, and Sirius was grinning with the specific delight of a man who has known for approximately 2 years that this was the shape of things and is deeply pleased to have been right. Voldemort, said Fleur, stepping back and straightening her robes. Still building, said Harry. 6 months, maybe 8, before he's operational. Then we have time. We have time, he agreed. Celeste's letter arrived the following morning. He'd sent her a full report after the session, his usual careful account. Her reply was shorter than most. I heard from Theodore. I watched in a mirror, yes, I have methods. You were magnificent. Not because of the chamber performance, though it was excellent. Because you were honest about those 2 people in France and Norway, and you have been honest about what was done to them for their whole lives, and you made the Wisengamot look at something it would very much have preferred not to look at. That is harder than any legal argument. Also Fleur came home this morning and told me you are well and I told her I knew and she told me to stop being cryptic and I told her some things don't require stating and she told me that was an annoying way to communicate and I told her she inherited it and she made the face you know. Come for Christmas. Bring Sirius. He is too thin again. I love you. Eat properly. Celeste. He read it twice. Folded it. Put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, where he kept her letters. Outside his window, the October sky was doing the specific thing it did over Scotland in autumn, vast and moving and utterly indifferent to the smallness of human architecture beneath it. The castle went on being awake in its old way, carrying its 800 years of magic with the settled ease of something that has always known what it was. Harry picked up the next letter on his desk. It was from Arbuthnot, and it concerned the cup. He read it, noted 3 points that required response, picked up his quill, and began. There was still Nagini. There was still Voldemort's return going fully operational, still the war that everyone who was paying attention knew was coming regardless of what Fudge chose to announce. There was still the question of what Ravensworth would do with the space Theodore had already identified him beginning to fill, building something new, something that didn't need the compact's formal structure. There was still the work of making the wizarding world understand that what was coming was real, that the denial was going to cost lives, that fear dressed as optimism was still fear. Harry wrote his response to Arbuthnot with the clean focus of someone who has dealt with what was in front of him and knows what is next. What was in front of him had always been the same thing, ever since a winter night in Surrey when an old woman's fire had burned away 45 reasons he was supposed to be less than he was. It was the same thing it had always been: be exactly what you are, honestly, without apology, and let the truth of that be sufficient. It had been sufficient. It would be. He sealed the letter, held it out for Hedwig, who accepted it with her usual dignity and launched herself from the windowsill into the October sky. Harry watched her go until she was a bright point in the vast Scottish grey. Then he picked up the next letter, and the next.